This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. At first, Nellie seemed nice enough. She was quiet and kept to herself, which was fine by me. I was busy trying to adjust to life in a new country and focusing on my studies. But about a week into the semester, strange things started happening. It began with the bathroom. Every single day, without fail, the toilet would get clogged. At first, I thought it was just bad plumbing, but it was always perfectly fine when I used it. It was only after Nellie used it that it would be a mess. I started to notice other odd things too. My shampoo bottle seemed to empty faster than it should, and sometimes I'd find long strands of blonde hair in my hairbrush. My hair is dark brown. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then things escalated. I'd be sitting in my room studying, and I'd hear these weird scratching noises coming from Nellie's side of the wall. It sounded like she was pressing her ear against it, listening to everything I was doing. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. and nearly had a heart attack when I saw Nellie's face peering at me through the crack in my door. Her eyes were wide open, just staring. When I called out Nellie, she quickly shut the door, and I heard her scrambling back to her room. I started spending less and less time in our dorm. I'd go to the library to study, hang out at my friend Maria's place, anything to avoid being alone with Nellie. But somehow, she always seemed to know where I was. I'd be grabbing coffee at the campus Starbucks, and there she'd be, sitting in the corner watching me. I'd go for a run in the park, and I'd see her lurking behind trees, pretending to be on her phone. It got to the point where I was constantly looking over my shoulder. I couldn't concentrate on my classes because I was always on edge, wondering where Nellie would pop up next. My grades started to slip, and I was losing sleep from the stress. I tried talking to our resident advisor about it, but they just told me to try and work things out with Nellie directly. When I did try to confront her, she'd just stare at me blankly and deny everything. "I don't know what you're talking about," she'd say in this eerie monotone. "You must be imagining things." Things came to a head one Friday night. I was hanging out with Maria in our dorm common room, trying to have a bit of normalcy. We were laughing about something when suddenly Nellie appeared out of nowhere. Before I could even react, she lunged at Maria, grabbing a fistful of her hair and slamming her head into the table. I screamed and tried to pull Nellie off, but she was freakishly strong. It took 2 other students to finally separate them. Maria ended up with a concussion and needed stitches. When campus security arrived, Nellie was calm as could be, insisting that Maria had attacked her first and she was just defending herself. I was shaking as I told the officers everything, the stalking, the weird behavior, all of it. They took my statement, but in the end, nothing really happened. Nellie got a stern warning from the university, but she was allowed to stay in our dorm. After that, I was terrified to even be in the same building as her. I begged the housing office to let me switch rooms, but they said there was nothing available. I ended up crashing on Maria's couch for weeks, too scared to go back to my own room. The psychological toll was immense. I couldn't sleep without having nightmares about Nellie standing over my bed. I'd jump at every little noise, convinced she was right behind me. My anxiety was through the roof, and I started having panic attacks. I went to the dean of students, the campus police, anyone who would listen. But it felt like no one was taking me seriously. They'd say things like, "Well, she hasn't actually threatened you directly," or "There's no evidence of any crime." It was like they were waiting for something terrible to happen before they'd act. I felt completely helpless and alone. Here I was, thousands of miles from home, being terrorized by my roommate, and the people who were supposed to protect me were failing at every turn. I started to regret ever coming to study in the U.S. The final straw came when I returned to my room one day to find all of my things rearranged. My clothes were folded differently, my books were in a new order, and worst of all, my laptop was open on my desk. I always shut it when I left. When I checked it, I found dozens of new files and folders that I didn't create. They were full of pictures of me, sleeping, studying, walking around campus. Nellie had been following me and documenting my every move. I grabbed whatever I could fit in a backpack and ran out of there, not even bothering to close the door behind me. I went straight to the airport and booked the first flight back to Brazil. I didn't care about my classes or my visa status or anything else. I just knew I had to get away. It's been 2 years since then, and I still have nightmares about Nellie. I never found out why she fixated on me or what her endgame was. The university eventually sent me an email saying they had addressed the situation, but they never gave me any details. Sometimes I wonder if I overreacted, if maybe I misinterpreted things. But then I remember the look in Nellie's eyes when she attacked Maria, the cold, emotionless stare as she denied everything, and I know in my gut that I was in real danger. I try not to let it control my life, but it's hard. I'm always looking over my shoulder, always a bit on edge. I have trouble trusting new people, especially roommates. Part of me is still angry at Nellie, at the university, at the whole system that failed to protect me when I needed it most. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened. All I know is that my American college dream turned into a nightmare that I'm still trying to wake up from. If you're reading this and you're in a similar situation, please don't wait like I did. Trust your instincts and get help, even if you have to leave everything behind. Your safety and sanity are worth more than any degree. It all started about a month ago. I'd just moved into this quaint little house in what seemed like a peaceful neighborhood. It was my first time living alone, and I was excited about the independence. The house was older but had character, with creaky wooden floors and a cozy feel. I thought I'd scored a great deal. At first, everything seemed normal. I was settling into my new routine, getting used to the sounds of the house. But then I started noticing little things that were off. Items in the kitchen weren't quite where I'd left them. The bathroom towel was slightly damp when I knew I hadn't used it. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness, figuring I was just forgetful in my new surroundings. But then the noises started, soft creaks and shuffles in the night that I couldn't explain. I'd wake up with my heart racing, straining to hear in the darkness. During the day, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noise, right? Maybe it was just settling. But the feeling of being watched was constant. I'd be sitting on the couch watching TV and suddenly get goosebumps, like someone was standing right behind me. I'd spin around, but there was never anyone there. One night, I woke up to use the bathroom and could have sworn I heard breathing coming from under the floor. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I stood there for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe myself. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the pipes or my imagination running wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I started sleeping with the lights on, checking and rechecking the locks obsessively. I even considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I had a hunch someone was in my house? They'd think I was crazy. It all came to a head last night. I'd had trouble falling asleep, tossing and turning for hours. Around 3 a.m. I heard a distinct thud from downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat. This wasn't my imagination. Someone was in the house. I lay there paralyzed with fear, my mind racing. Should I call 911? Try to confront the intruder? As I was debating my options, I heard slow, careful footsteps on the stairs. They were coming up to where I was. In a panic, I grabbed my phone and hid in the closet, trying to muffle my ragged breathing. Through a crack in the door, I saw a shadow pass by. A tall, thin figure moved silently through my bedroom, pausing by my empty bed. I watched in horror as the figure bent down and seemed to sniff my pillow. My skin crawled. Who was this person? What did they want? Just then, my phone vibrated with a text notification. The sound seemed deafening in the silence. The figure's head snapped up, looking directly at the closet. I held my breath, praying they hadn't heard, but they had. Slow, deliberate footsteps approached the closet. I could see dirty, bare feet through the gap under the door. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The door began to open, and I knew I had to act. In desperation, I burst out of the closet, shoving past the intruder with all my strength. I heard a grunt and the sound of them falling as I raced for the stairs. I flew down the steps, nearly falling in my haste. I could hear them coming after me, their footsteps thundering behind me. I made it to the front door, fumbling with the locks with shaking hands. Just as I got the door open, I felt fingers grasp at my shirt. With a scream, I wrenched free and ran out into the street. I didn't stop running until I reached the police station several blocks away. The officers were skeptical at first, but agreed to check out the house. What they found chills me to this day. In the crawl space beneath my house, accessed through a hidden trapdoor in the floor, they discovered a makeshift living area. There was a dirty mattress, some stolen food and water, and disturbingly, a lot of my personal belongings. Clothes, photos, even some of my mail. But the worst part was the notebook they found. It detailed my daily routine with terrifying precision. When I left for work, what I wore, when I showered, what I watched on TV. This person had been studying my every move for weeks. They caught the guy trying to flee through the woods behind the house. I couldn't bring myself to look at him when they brought him out. I didn't want to see the face of the person who had violated my privacy and sense of safety so completely. It's been a few days, and I still can't wrap my head around it all. How long had he been living there? How many nights had I slept peacefully, unaware of the predator lurking just feet below me? I'm staying with a friend now. I can't go back to that house. The idea of sleeping there makes me physically ill. I jump at every sound, flinch at unexpected movements. I feel like I'll never feel safe again. The police say he'll be charged with breaking and entering, stalking and theft. But no punishment seems enough for the terror he's put me through. My sense of security, my belief in the safety of my own home, has been shattered. I keep replaying every moment in my mind, wondering how I didn't realize sooner. All those little signs I dismissed. I should have trusted my instincts. Now I'm left wondering if I'll ever be able to live alone again. How can I trust that I'm truly alone in a house? The psychological toll has been immense. I'm seeing a therapist, trying to process the trauma. But every time I close my eyes, I see that figure in my room, smell the musty odor that I now realize was coming from beneath the floorboards all along. I'm sharing this as a warning. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't ignore the signs like I did. And please, check your crawl spaces and attics. You never know what or who might be hiding there. I don't know how to move forward from here. The world suddenly feels so much more dangerous, so much more unpredictable. I'm left with so many questions that I'll probably never get answers to. Why me? What were his intentions? How many others has he done this to? For now, I'm taking it one day at a time, trying to rebuild my sense of safety, piece by piece. But I know I'll never be the same. The innocence of feeling secure in your own home is gone, replaced by a constant vigilance that I fear will never fully subside. If you're reading this and something similar is happening to you, don't wait. Don't second-guess yourself. Get help. Call the police. It's better to be safe than to go through what I've experienced. I hope that by sharing my story, I can prevent someone else from living through this nightmare. Stay safe out there, and always trust your gut. You never know what might be lurking just beneath the surface. The day of the gathering arrived, and I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as I drove to the address Annie had given me. It was a large, somewhat run-down house on the outskirts of town. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed several cars parked outside and muffled voices coming from inside. I took a deep breath and knocked. Annie greeted me with a warm smile and ushered me in. The living room was dimly lit with candles, and about a dozen people were seated in a circle on cushions on the floor. The air felt thick and heavy, and I immediately sensed an intense energy in the room. Annie introduced me to the group and motioned for me to take a seat. As I sat down, I scanned the faces around me. Most looked to be in their 20s and 30s, with a mix of apprehension and eagerness in their expressions. At the head of the circle sat an older man with long gray hair and piercing blue eyes. He exuded an aura of authority that made me uneasy. "Welcome, seekers," the man began in a deep, measured voice. "I am Gabriel, your guide on this journey of spiritual awakening and healing. Tonight, we will peel back the layers of trauma and pain that hold us back from our true potential." A chill ran down my spine at his words. This was not at all what I had expected when Annie invited me. I glanced at her, but she was focused intently on Gabriel with an almost trance-like expression. Gabriel continued, "To begin, we will go around the circle and share the deepest wounds of our past. Only by reliving our trauma can we truly release it and ascend to a higher plane of consciousness." My heart began to race. Share my deepest traumas with a group of strangers? Every instinct told me to get up and leave, but I felt frozen in place. The sharing began with a young woman to Gabriel's right. Through tears, she recounted a horrific story of childhood abuse. Gabriel nodded solemnly, occasionally interjecting to ask probing questions that seemed to intensify her distress. As she finished, Gabriel placed his hand on her head and closed his eyes. "I sense the darkness leaving you," he intoned. "Let it go and embrace the light." The woman collapsed into sobs as the next person began to share. With growing horror, I realized I was expected to participate in this bizarre ritual. My palms grew sweaty as I racked my brain for an escape plan. But before I could act, Gabriel's eyes locked onto mine. "You there, our newest seeker. I sense great pain and turmoil within you. Please, share your burden with us so we may help you heal." I felt like a deer in headlights as all eyes turned to me. I'm not sure I'm comfortable sharing anything so personal," I stammered. Gabriel's expression hardened. "Resistance only prolongs your suffering. Trust in the process. Let your guard down and allow us to guide you to enlightenment." The pressure was overwhelming. I could feel the group's expectation bearing down on me. In a moment of panic, I blurted out a traumatic experience from my past that I had never spoken of before. As the words spilled out, I felt raw and exposed. Tears streamed down my face as I relived the painful memories. Gabriel nodded with satisfaction. Yes, let it all out. Feel the trauma leaving your body. But I didn't feel relieved or healed. I felt violated and manipulated. As I finished speaking, Gabriel approached and placed his hands on my head. His touch made my skin crawl. "I'm channeling healing energy into you," he said. "Can you feel the light entering your body, washing away the darkness?" I wanted to scream that I felt nothing but revulsion, but I found myself nodding mutely, too shocked and overwhelmed to resist. The sharing continued around the circle, each story more horrific than the last. I sat in stunned silence, my mind reeling. How had I ended up here? Why was Annie participating in this madness? As the last person finished, Gabriel stood and raised his arms. "You have all taken the first step on your journey to enlightenment. The trauma you've released tonight has opened you up to receive divine wisdom and healing. But this is only the beginning. True ascension requires dedication and sacrifice." He went on to explain a series of increasingly expensive courses and retreats that would lead to higher levels of spiritual awakening. It suddenly clicked that this was all an elaborate scam to exploit vulnerable people. I wanted nothing more than to bolt for the door, but I was afraid of drawing attention to myself. So I sat quietly as Gabriel concluded the meeting with a meditation, fighting the urge to cry or scream. When it was finally over, people began to mill about and chat. I made a beeline for Annie, desperate for answers. "What the hell was that?" I hissed. "You didn't tell me it would be anything like this." Annie's eyes were glazed over. "Isn't it amazing? I feel so cleansed and enlightened. Gabriel is a true spiritual master." I realized with a sinking feeling that Annie was completely under Gabriel's spell. "This isn't right," I pleaded. "Can't you see how manipulative and exploitative this is?" She shook her head sadly. "You're not ready to receive the truth yet, but you will be, in time. That's why I brought you here." A wave of betrayal washed over me. "You mean you've been recruiting people through dating apps? How could you do that?" "I'm helping people find their true path," Annie insisted. "Gabriel showed me the light, and now I want to share it with others." I backed away, feeling sick to my stomach. "This is wrong, Annie. Please get help." But she just smiled serenely and turned away to talk to another group member. I stumbled towards the door, my head spinning. As I reached for the doorknob, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Gabriel standing there, his blue eyes boring into me. "Leaving so soon?" he asked softly. "Your journey has only just begun. I sense great potential in you. Don't let fear hold you back from true enlightenment." A chill ran through me at his words. I mumbled something about needing to get home and practically ran out the door. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face as I hurried to my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw Gabriel standing on the porch, watching me leave. I drove home in a daze, feeling violated and shaken to my core. How could I have been so naive? I was furious at Annie for luring me there under false pretenses, but also worried for her and the others still trapped in Gabriel's web of manipulation. That night, I tossed and turned, plagued by nightmares of the trauma I'd been forced to relive. In the days that followed, I felt raw and on edge, jumping at every sound. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. I thought about reporting the group to the authorities, but I had no real evidence of wrongdoing, and a part of me was afraid of retaliation if I spoke out. So I stayed quiet, deleting my dating apps and withdrawing from social activities. It's been weeks now, and I still feel haunted by that night. I can't shake the memory of Gabriel's piercing gaze or the vacant look in Annie's eyes. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I narrowly escaped something truly sinister. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from this experience or understand how I let myself get pulled into such a situation. All I know is that I'll never again ignore my instincts when they tell me something isn't right, and I'll always be wary of those who claim to have all the answers, especially when it comes to matters of the spirit and mind. That all changed on a cold Tuesday night in November. Tom and I were studying late, trying to cram for midterms. Around 1 a.m. we heard shouting outside. Not unusual for our street, so we didn't think much of it at first. But then it got louder. Angry voices, swearing, the sound of glass breaking. I peeked out the window and saw 2 men on the sidewalk in front of our house. They looked to be in their 30s, clearly drunk or high on something. One was tall and lanky with greasy long hair, the other shorter but muscular with a shaved head. I didn't recognize them as our neighbors, but figured they must live nearby. "Oi, we know you're in there," the tall one yelled, looking right at our window. I quickly ducked down, my heart racing. Tom came over. "What's going on?" "I don't know," I whispered. "These guys outside seem really angry about something." We heard more shouting, then a loud thud against our front door. Tom and I looked at each other in shock. Were they trying to break in? "Open up, you fucking cunts," the muscular one bellowed. More thuds and the sound of splintering wood. "Oh my God, call the police," I said, fumbling for my phone with shaking hands. Tom ran to brace the door while I dialed 9999. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation to the operator. She assured me help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity as the pounding and shouting continued. "We're gonna fuck you up. You can't hide in there forever." The threats and obscenities they were screaming made my blood run cold. I had no idea who these men were or why they were targeting us. Had we accidentally done something to piss off the wrong people? Was this a case of mistaken identity? Or were they just randomly choosing a house to terrorize? Whatever the reason, it was clear they meant business. The door was starting to splinter and give way under the constant battering. Tom was using all his strength to hold it shut, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We both knew it was only a matter of time before they broke through. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a tall floor lamp, and stood ready to swing it if they got in. My whole body was trembling. I'd never felt such pure, primal fear before. Just when I thought the door was about to cave in, we heard sirens approaching. The men outside started swearing, and I heard footsteps running away. A wave of relief washed over me, but I still couldn't stop shaking. The police arrived moments later. They took our statements and searched the area, but the men were long gone by then. They told us to stay inside and lock up while they investigated further. Tom and I were too shaken to sleep. We sat huddled together on the couch, jumping at every little sound. Around 5 a.m., there was a knock at the door. I nearly had a heart attack before realizing it was the police again. They had caught the 2 men a few blocks away. Turns out they were our next-door neighbors. We'd never actually met them before. The police found them with a bunch of meth and a large kitchen knife. It was clear they had intended to hurt us, though we still don't know why. Maybe the drugs made them paranoid, and they imagined we'd wronged them somehow. The officers assured us the men were in custody and wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. But that didn't do much to ease my fears. Knowing they had been living right next door this whole time, possibly watching us, planning this attack, it made me feel sick. We moved out the very next day. I couldn't bear to spend another night in that house. For weeks afterwards, I had terrible nightmares about men breaking down doors and chasing me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Even now, years later, I still get anxious when I hear raised voices outside at night. The sound of someone pounding on a door sends me into a panic. I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings, checking and double-checking that doors and windows are locked. The rational part of my brain knows those specific men can't hurt me anymore, but the fear they instilled lives on. I often wonder how differently things might have turned out if the police hadn't arrived when they did. Would Tom and I have been able to fight them off? The thought makes me shudder. I try not to dwell on the what-ifs too much, but it's hard not to when something like that happens to you. It fundamentally changes how you see the world. I used to feel relatively safe in my own home. Now I'm always on edge, waiting for the next threat to appear. Therapy has helped somewhat, but I don't think I'll ever fully get over that night. It opened my eyes to how quickly things can go wrong, how vulnerable we all are. You never really know what's going on behind closed doors, what darkness might be lurking next door. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others, especially students living on their own for the first time. Be aware of your surroundings. Get to know your neighbors if you can. And most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to call for help, even if you're not 100% sure it's needed. I'm so grateful I made that 999 call when I did. A few minutes later might have been too late. I still have a lot of healing to do, but I'm working on it day by day. Writing this out has been cathartic in a way. Maybe by sharing my experience I can help someone else avoid a similar situation, or at least let others who've been through something like this know they're not alone. To anyone reading this who's dealing with the aftermath of trauma, it does get better, slowly but surely. Be patient with yourself and don't be afraid to lean on others for support. And remember, what happened to you doesn't define you. You are so much stronger than you know. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. It's been years, but the memories still haunt me. I guess I should start from the beginning. It was just another ordinary day at school when Leo first approached me. He was the new kid, an immigrant from Guatemala who had recently moved to our town. I remember feeling a mix of curiosity and sympathy as he nervously introduced himself in halting English. There was something endearing about his shy smile and the way he fumbled with his words. Over the next few weeks, Leo and I started talking more. He would seek me out between classes, eager to practice his English. I found myself looking forward to our little chats. He had a great sense of humor and always managed to make me laugh, even on tough days. Before long, we were texting regularly and hanging out after school. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags. Leo's texts became more frequent, sometimes bordering on excessive. He'd get upset if I didn't respond quickly enough. At the time, I chalked it up to cultural differences or his eagerness to make friends in a new country. I never imagined it would spiral into something so terrifying. Things took a dark turn when I started dating someone else. Leo's demeanor changed almost overnight. The sweet, funny guy I knew was replaced by someone I barely recognized. His texts became angry and demanding. He'd bombard me with messages, alternating between declarations of love and vicious insults. One day, I opened my locker to find a crumpled note inside. My blood ran cold as I read Leo's messy scrawl. "You belong to me. No one else can have you. I confronted him, telling him to back off and that we were just friends. His eyes flashed with a rage I'd never seen before. "You'll regret this," he hissed before storming off. That's when the real nightmare began. Suddenly, Leo was everywhere. I'd catch glimpses of him following me in the hallways, always lurking just out of sight. He'd show up at places I frequented, the library, the local coffee shop, even outside my house. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night to see a shadowy figure outside my window. I'm almost certain it was him. The constant fear was suffocating. I started changing my routines, taking different routes to class, and always looking over my shoulder. My grades began to slip as I struggled to concentrate. My friends noticed the change in me, but I was too ashamed and scared to tell them what was really going on. Things escalated when Leo started posting about me on social media. At first it was just vague, passive-aggressive statuses. But then he began sharing old photos of us together, adding suggestive captions that made my skin crawl. The worst was when he posted a clearly photoshopped image of us in an intimate pose. I reported it immediately, but the damage was done. The whispers and stares at school became unbearable. I finally broke down and told my parents everything. They were horrified and immediately contacted the school and the police. But Leo was clever. He always seemed to know just how far he could push things without crossing into clear legal territory. The school gave him a stern warning, but it did little to deter him. The messages continued, each one more disturbing than the last. "I see you," he'd write, followed by details of what I was wearing or doing at that exact moment. Sometimes he'd describe my bedroom in vivid detail, making me wonder if he'd somehow been inside my house. I changed my phone number countless times, but he always managed to get the new one. One particularly terrifying incident stands out in my memory. I was walking home from a late study session at the library when I heard footsteps behind me. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, but the footsteps sped up too. In a panic, I ducked into a nearby convenience store. As I pretended to browse the aisles, I saw Leo's reflection in the security mirror, watching me from just outside the store. I called my dad in tears, and he came to pick me up. Leo was gone by the time we left, but the fear lingered. The final straw came during our senior year. I arrived at school one morning to find my locker plastered with dozens of photos, all of me. There were shots of me at home, at school, even on a family vacation. It was clear he'd been stalking me for months, maybe even years. I broke down right there in the hallway, surrounded by the evidence of his obsession. That was the day my parents decided we needed to move. We packed up and left town within a week, not even waiting for me to finish the school year. I had to leave behind my friends, my life, everything I knew. But the alternative was unthinkable. Even after moving, I didn't feel safe. I deleted all my social media accounts and changed my name on any online profiles I couldn't completely erase. For months, I jumped at every unexpected noise, convinced Leo had somehow found me. It's been 3 years since I last saw or heard from Leo. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, searching for me. The rational part of my brain knows he's probably moved on, but the fear never fully goes away. I still catch myself looking over my shoulder sometimes, half expecting to see his face in the crowd. I'm slowly rebuilding my life now, but the scars remain. Trust doesn't come easily anymore. Every new friendship or potential relationship is colored by the memory of what happened with Leo. I'm in therapy, working through the trauma, but some days are still a struggle. I often think about what might have happened if I had recognized the warning signs earlier, or if someone had taken my concerns more seriously. Maybe things wouldn't have escalated so far. I hope that by sharing my story, I can help others recognize the red flags of obsessive behavior before it's too late. To anyone out there dealing with a similar situation, you're not alone, and it's not your fault. Don't be afraid to speak up and ask for help. Your safety and peace of mind are worth fighting for. And to those who might be tempted to pursue someone who's clearly not interested, please take a step back and examine your actions. No one deserves to live in fear. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time. Some days are better than others, but I'm determined not to let Leo's actions define the rest of my life. I'm learning to trust again, to open up to new experiences and relationships. It's a slow process, but I'm getting there, and that's a victory in itself. When Anastasia arrived, I was immediately struck by her intense gaze and eccentric style. She wore a long, flowing dress covered in mystical symbols and had crystals dangling around her neck. As I welcomed her in, she paused at the threshold and whispered something under her breath before entering. I brushed it off as just a little New Age oddity. We sat down on the couch, and I offered her a glass of wine. As we started talking, things quickly took a strange turn. Out of nowhere, Anastasia declared, "I should tell you who I really am. I am the lost princess Anastasia Romanov, sole survivor of the Russian royal family." I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking, but her face remained deadly serious as she launched into an elaborate tale about escaping execution, time travel, and living in secret for decades. I tried to steer the conversation to more normal topics, but she kept circling back to her supposed royal heritage. "You don't believe me, do you?" she said, her eyes narrowing. "I can prove it. I have powers passed down through the Romanov bloodline." Before I could react, she grabbed my hands and started chanting in what sounded like Russian. The room seemed to grow colder and darker. I yanked my hands away, feeling deeply unsettled. "Please, let's just have a normal evening," I pleaded. But Anastasia was on a roll now. She stood up and began pacing around my living room, muttering about cosmic energies and spirit realms. Suddenly she fixated on a photo of my cat on the mantel. "Ah, you have a feline guardian. Cats are the gatekeepers between worlds. We must commune with it immediately." I explained that my cat was actually at the vet for the night. This sent Anastasia into a frenzy. No, this is all wrong. We need feline energy for the ritual. Quick, we must go find street cats to bring back here." At this point, I was getting seriously freaked out. I suggested maybe we should call it a night. This only agitated her further. "You doubt my powers? You dare dismiss a Romanov princess?" she snarled. "Perhaps you need a demonstration." She began twirling around the room, arms outstretched, chanting loudly in that strange language. Knickknacks started vibrating on the shelves. The lights flickered ominously. I was frozen in place, unsure if I was hallucinating or if this was really happening. Wind seemed to whip through the room, though all the windows were closed. Anastasia's hair billowed around her wildly as her chants grew more frenzied. Suddenly she stopped and pointed at me dramatically. "You have angered the spirits by your disbelief. Dark forces gather around you. Only I can protect you now." She lunged towards me, and I instinctively scrambled backwards, knocking over a side table in the process. The loud crash seemed to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. Anastasia blinked rapidly, looking momentarily confused. Then her face contorted in anger. "You've disrupted the energy. The ritual is ruined." She stormed towards the front door. As she flung it open, she turned back with a bone-chilling glare. "You've made a grave mistake tonight. The curse of the Romanovs will follow you now. Beware the spirits that I've awakened." With that ominous declaration, she swept out into the night. I slammed the door behind her and immediately deadbolted it, my hands shaking. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my couch, jumping at every little sound. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I really experienced some kind of supernatural event? Or was Anastasia just an extremely convincing actress with an elaborate prank? As the first light of dawn filtered through my windows, I started to calm down slightly. In the harsh light of day, it all seemed absurd. Clearly, I had just had a run-in with someone who was mentally unwell or on drugs. I resolved to be more careful about who I invited over in the future. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There on my coffee table was a small object I'd never seen before, an ornate Fabergé egg. I knew I didn't own anything like that. Anastasia must have left it behind. With trembling hands, I picked it up to examine it. As I turned it over, I saw an inscription on the bottom in Cyrillic letters. My phone translation app revealed the chilling message, "The Romanov legacy lives on." I dropped the egg in shock. It shattered on the floor, releasing a cloud of strange-smelling smoke. As the mist curled around me, I swear I heard the faint sound of balalaika music and a woman's laughter echoing in the distance. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. Was it all an elaborate hoax, a shared hallucination? Or did I truly have an encounter with something beyond normal explanation? All I know is that I deleted Tinder immediately after, and I've developed a newfound wariness of Russian history, self-proclaimed shamans, and mysterious eggs. Sometimes at night I still wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by Anastasia's final words. I may never know if there was any truth to her claims or her curse, but I'll certainly never forget that terrifying Tinder date from hell. It was early May, and a group of us had planned a camping trip to Lake Simcoe. There were 6 of us, me, my girlfriend Amy, and our friends Ben, Tim, Jessica, and Mike. We were all excited to spend a few days in nature, grilling food, swimming, and just hanging out around the campfire. We arrived at the campground on Friday afternoon and set up our tents near the lakeshore. It was a beautiful spot, with towering pine trees and a view of the sparkling water. As we were getting settled, I noticed another group setting up camp about 50 yards away. They seemed rowdy, blasting music and yelling to each other as they unloaded their truck. I tried not to let it bother me, figuring they'd quiet down once it got dark. We spent the rest of the afternoon swimming and exploring the area. That evening, we gathered around our campfire to roast hot dogs and marshmallows. The other group was still being pretty loud, but we did our best to ignore them and enjoy ourselves. Around 11 p.m., most of us decided to turn in for the night. Ben and Tim said they were going to stay up a bit longer to have a few more beers. I crawled into my tent with Amy and fell into an uneasy sleep, the bass from the other group's music still thumping in the distance. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by screaming. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it was just the rowdy campers getting louder. But then I heard Ben yell, "Help! Oh God, help!" followed by a blood-curdling scream that made my skin crawl. I scrambled out of the tent, my heart racing. In the dim moonlight, I could make out 2 men attacking Ben and Tim. One had Ben pinned to the ground while the other was on top of Tim, and I saw the glint of a knife. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Get away from them!" The attackers looked up, and I froze in terror. Their eyes were wild, almost feral. They didn't look human. One of them snarled and started running towards me. I stumbled backwards, tripping over a tent stake and falling hard on my back. The man was on me in seconds, his face inches from mine. His breath reeked of alcohol and something chemical. He pressed a knife against my throat and growled, "Don't fucking move." I was paralyzed with fear, certain I was about to die. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the other attacker still on top of Tim, bringing the knife down again and again. Tim's screams had turned to weak, gurgling sounds. Suddenly there was a loud crack, and the man on top of me went limp. Mike was standing there, a large branch in his hands. He'd apparently snuck up behind the attacker and clubbed him in the head. "Oh shit, oh shit," Mike was muttering, his eyes wide with panic. The commotion had alerted the other attacker, who jumped up and charged at Mike. They grappled for a moment before tumbling to the ground. I snapped out of my daze and scrambled to my feet, looking around desperately for a weapon. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from our picnic table and ran to help Mike. The attacker had Mike pinned and was trying to stab him. I swung the flashlight as hard as I could, connecting with the side of the man's head. He slumped to the side, momentarily stunned. "Run!" I yelled to Mike. "Get help!" Mike took off towards the main campground office. I turned my attention to Ben and Tim, who were both lying motionless on the ground. There was so much blood. I felt sick to my stomach. I heard groaning behind me and spun around. The first attacker was starting to regain consciousness. Panic seized me again. I grabbed Amy, who had emerged from our tent, and pulled her towards the lake. "We have to hide," I said, my voice shaking. We splashed into the shallow water, wading out until it was up to our chests. We crouched down, shivering, only our heads above the surface. I could hear shouting from the campsite, but I was too terrified to look. We stayed there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. Finally, we heard sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees. Only then did we slowly make our way back to shore. The scene at our campsite was chaotic. There were several police cars and an ambulance. Officers were putting the two attackers in handcuffs. Apparently, they had tried to flee across the dry part of the lake bed, but got stuck in the mud. Ben and Tim were being loaded into the ambulance. They were both alive, but in bad shape. Tim had lost a lot of blood from multiple stab wounds. Ben had been stabbed in the shoulder and had a concussion from being beaten. The police took our statements. They said the attackers were likely high on meth or bath salts, which explained their insane strength and erratic behavior. It seemed we had just been random targets of their drug-fueled violence. Ben and Tim both survived, thankfully. Tim needed several surgeries and a lot of physical therapy, but he eventually recovered, physically at least. Mentally, none of us have fully recovered. I still have trouble sleeping. Any unexpected noise at night sends me into a panic. I can't go camping anymore. Even the thought of sleeping in a tent gives me anxiety attacks. The sound of laughter from strangers makes me tense up, remembering the rowdy group that camped near us that night. It's been 2 years, and I'm still in therapy trying to process what happened. The randomness of it all is what haunts me the most. We did nothing to provoke those men. We were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it nearly cost us our lives. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Mike hadn't woken up when he did, or if I hadn't found that flashlight to fight off the second attacker. The what-ifs can drive you crazy if you let them. I try to focus on the fact that we all survived. We're still here, still friends. But our lives are forever changed. A fun weekend turned into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. I know now how quickly everything can change. how fragile our sense of safety really is. I'm sharing this story as a warning, I guess. Be aware of your surroundings, trust your instincts if something feels off, and cherish every moment with the people you love, because you never know when it might be the last. To this day, I can't drive past a campground without my heart rate spiking. The smell of a campfire makes me nauseous. I've had to find new ways to enjoy nature, day hikes, picnics in well-populated parks. But a part of me will always miss those carefree days of pitching a tent by a lake and falling asleep to the sound of crickets. I hope someday I can overcome this fear and trauma. But for now, I'm just taking it one day at a time, grateful to be alive and trying to find joy in the little things. If you're planning a camping trip, please be safe out there. And maybe bring some extra flashlights, just in case. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. I was 10 years old, spending the summer at my family's property in southern Mississippi. We had this beautiful lake on the land where I loved to go fishing. My parents always told me not to go alone, but being a stubborn kid, I'd often sneak off with just my dog Booley for company. That particular day started like any other. It was hot and humid, typical Mississippi summer weather. I woke up early, grabbed my fishing rod, and whistled for Booley. He was always excited for our little adventures. We made our way down to the lake, the morning dew still clinging to the grass. The lake was peaceful, with a light mist hovering over the water. I found my favorite spot, a large rock that jutted out into the water, giving me a perfect vantage point to cast my line. Booley settled down next to me, his tail wagging contentedly. I don't know how long I'd been fishing, maybe an hour or two. I was so focused on trying to catch something that I didn't notice the change in atmosphere at first. It was subtle, like a shift in the air pressure. Suddenly the birds stopped chirping, and the insects fell silent. That's when I felt it, this overwhelming sense of being watched. My heart started racing, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to tell myself I was being silly, that it was just my imagination running wild. But then I noticed Booley. He was standing now, his ears perked up and his body tense. He was staring intently at something behind me, towards the tree line. Slowly, I turned my head to look. At first I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the dense line of trees that surrounded the lake. But then, movement caught my eye. There, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees, was a figure. It was a man, I think. Tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen. He was just standing there, perfectly still, watching us. I couldn't make out any features. It was like looking at a silhouette. But I could feel his eyes on me. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to scream for help, but I was frozen in place. Booley let out a low growl, which snapped me out of my paralysis. I knew I needed to leave, but I was terrified of making any sudden movements. With shaking hands, I started to pack up my fishing gear. I tried to appear calm, like I hadn't noticed the figure. But my heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. As I was packing, I kept glancing towards the tree line. The figure was moving. Slowly, so slowly, it was inching closer to the edge of the trees. I could see it more clearly now, and that only made it worse. It was definitely shaped like a man, but something was off. The proportions weren't quite right. Its arms seemed too long, its legs too thin. I finished packing and stood up, my legs feeling like jelly. Booley positioned himself between me and the figure, still growling softly. I started walking away from the lake, towards the path that led back to our house. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but somehow I knew that would be a mistake. So I walked, slowly, steadily, fighting every urge to look back. Booley walked backwards, keeping his eyes on whatever was behind us. The sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling told me the figure was moving too. It felt like the longest walk of my life. Every step was an eternity, every breath a struggle. I could feel the presence getting closer, hear its footsteps getting louder. But I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, I reached the edge of the clearing where our house stood. Only then did I allow myself to turn around. There was nothing there. The tree line was empty, the lake peaceful once again. But the feeling of being watched lingered. I ran the rest of the way to the house, Booley right at my heels. I burst through the door, startling my mom who was in the kitchen. She took one look at my pale face and knew something was wrong. I broke down, sobbing, trying to explain what had happened between gasps for air. My parents searched the property, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything unusual. They tried to convince me it was just my imagination, that I'd scared myself. But I knew what I'd seen, and Booley knew too. He wouldn't leave my side for days after that. We stayed at the property for the rest of the summer, but I never went back to the lake alone. In fact, I rarely went outside at all. The feeling of safety I'd always had there was gone, replaced by a constant sense of unease. Even now, all these years later, I can't shake the memory of that day. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know it was real. Whatever I saw that day by the lake, it changed me. It took away my sense of security, my belief that I was safe in familiar places. I've never told this story to many people. Who would believe it? A kid seeing a strange figure in the woods. It sounds like something out of a campfire tale, but I know what I experienced. The terror I felt that day was real, and it stayed with me all these years. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I still feel that sense of being watched. And I wonder, was that really the only time I encountered whatever was in those woods? Or has it been there all along, just waiting for me to notice? I don't have answers. I probably never will. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never forget that day by the lake and the fear that has followed me ever since. As we strolled along the walking path, chatting and laughing like we always do, I noticed a car slowly driving by. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then it passed us again, going even slower. That's when I got an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I glanced at Sam, and I could tell she noticed it too. Suddenly, the car came to a stop right next to us. The windows rolled down, and I saw 4 guys inside, all staring at us with these creepy grins on their faces. One of them leaned out and started yelling obscenities at us. My heart started racing, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Sam grabbed my arm, and we quickly veered off the path into the woods. We ran deeper into the trees, trying to put as much distance between us and those men as possible. I could hear the car door slamming and voices shouting. They were getting out of the car and coming after us. Panic set in as we realized we were being hunted. We crouched behind some bushes, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The sound of footsteps and rustling leaves got closer and closer. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. After what felt like an eternity, the voices started to fade. We waited for another 15 minutes before we dared to move. Shaking and out of breath, we made our way back to the parking lot, constantly looking over our shoulders. As soon as we got to Sam's car, we locked the doors and sped out of there. We were both in shock, unable to process what had just happened. You'd think after an experience like that, we'd never go back to Grant Park, but a week later, we decided to return. I know it sounds crazy, but we didn't want those creeps to take away a place we loved. We figured it was a one-time thing, and surely lightning wouldn't strike twice. Boy, were we wrong. This time, we parked in a different area and decided to explore a part of the park we hadn't been to before. Everything seemed fine at first. We were on high alert, but there was no sign of trouble. We even started to relax a little, thinking maybe we had overreacted the last time. That's when I heard it, the sound of an engine revving in the distance. I froze, my eyes meeting Sam's. We both knew. They were back. We started walking faster, trying to act normal while looking for a place to hide. The sound of the car got louder, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Just as we spotted a small cluster of trees to duck behind, the car came into view. It was the same one from before. Without a word, Sam and I broke into a run. We could hear shouts behind us and the sound of car doors slamming. This time, they weren't just yelling. They were chasing us. We ran through the trees, branches scratching our arms and faces. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, getting closer. Sam stumbled, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her along. We burst out of the wooded area into a small playground. There were a few families there, and for a split second, I thought we were safe. But these guys didn't care. They came charging out of the trees, ignoring the shocked looks from the parents and kids. We didn't stop to explain, just kept running. I heard screams and shouts behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We ran into a nearby housing development, hoping to lose them among the houses. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me going. We zigzagged through backyards, hopped fences, and ducked behind sheds. All the while, I could hear them calling out to each other, coordinating their search. At one point, we hid in someone's garage that had been left open. We crouched behind a car, trying to catch our breath. I could hear them on the street, their voices getting closer. Sam was shaking next to me, tears streaming down her face. I put my hand over her mouth, afraid they might hear her sobbing. One of them walked right past the garage entrance. I thought my heart was going to explode. He paused for a moment, and I was sure he was going to look inside, but then he moved on. We waited for what felt like hours before we dared to move. When we finally thought it was safe, we made a break for it. We ran back towards the park, towards Sam's car. Every shadow, every sound made me jump. I kept expecting them to appear out of nowhere. By some miracle, we made it back to the car. Sam's hands were shaking so badly, she could barely get the key in the ignition. As soon as the engine started, we peeled out of there, not even bothering with seat belts. We drove for miles, not saying a word, both of us in shock. When we finally felt safe enough to stop, we pulled over and just broke down. The realization of how close we had come to God knows what was overwhelming. To this day, I still have nightmares about those men chasing us. We reported it to the police, but nothing ever came of it. They said without more information, there wasn't much they could do. Sam and I have never been back to Grant Park, and I don't think we ever will. I still can't understand why they targeted us or why they were so persistent. It's like they saw us as prey, and the chase was some sick game to them. The thought that they might still be out there, doing this to other women, keeps me up at night. This experience has changed me. I'm always looking over my shoulder now, always aware of my surroundings. I carry pepper spray and take self-defense classes. But no matter how prepared I try to be, I can't shake the feeling that I'm never truly safe. I share this story as a warning to others. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And please, be careful out there. You never know when a simple walk in the park could turn into a fight for your life. I still can't believe what happened to me last week. I've been trying to process it ever since, but I'm honestly still shaken up. I guess I should start from the beginning. I've been using Tinder on and off for a while now, mostly just for casual dating. Nothing too serious. But this one guy, let's call him Mark, seemed different. We'd been chatting for a couple weeks and he came across as sweet, funny, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. When he suggested meeting up for dinner, I felt excited rather than my usual apprehension about first dates. We agreed that he'd pick me up at my place at 7 p.m. on Friday. I spent way too long getting ready, trying on different outfits and redoing my makeup. By the time 7 o'clock rolled around, I was a bundle of nervous energy. I saw his car pull up outside and took a deep breath before heading out. Mark looked just like his pictures. Tall, dark hair, nice smile. He greeted me warmly and opened the passenger door for me. As we started driving, the conversation flowed easily. He asked about my day, told me a funny story about his coworker. I started to relax, thinking this might actually turn out to be a great date. But after about 15 minutes, I realized we were heading in the opposite direction of downtown, where all the restaurants are. When I mentioned this, Mark just laughed it off. "Oh, I know a great little place a bit out of the way. Trust me, it'll be worth it." I tried to keep my unease at bay. Maybe he really did know some hidden gem of a restaurant. But as we kept driving further and further from the city, my anxiety started to spike. The buildings and streetlights grew sparse, replaced by thick woods on either side of the road. Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark glanced at his phone mounted on the dashboard. "Yeah, the GPS says we're on track. Should be there soon." But another 10 minutes passed, and we were deep in the forest now. My heart was pounding. I subtly tried to pull up my own GPS, but of course there was no signal out here. "Mark, I'm sorry, but I'm getting really uncomfortable," I finally blurted out. "Can we please turn around?" He sighed heavily. "Look, I think we must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The GPS keeps recalculating. Let me pull over and try to figure it out." He pulled onto the shoulder, and I immediately reached for the door handle, ready to bolt into the woods if I had to. But it was locked. Ice-cold panic flooded my veins. "Hey, relax," Mark said, noticing my reaction. "The child locks must be on. Here." He hit a button and I heard the doors unlock. I let out a shaky breath. Mark fiddled with his phone for a few minutes, muttering under his breath. I sat rigid in my seat, every muscle tense. Finally, he looked up. "Okay, I think I've got it figured out now. The restaurant is actually back the other way. I'm so sorry about this. I feel like an idiot." He turned the car around and we headed back towards civilization. I wanted to believe it had all been an honest mistake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. We eventually made it to the restaurant, a pretty generic-looking place, certainly nothing special enough to justify that detour. Throughout dinner, I couldn't relax. Every time Mark's hand moved, I flinched. He tried to keep up a conversation, but I gave mostly one-word answers. Then things got even worse. Mark started making increasingly sexual comments, asking about my wildest experiences and if I was adventurous in bed. I shut it down immediately, telling him that was inappropriate. He backed off, but kept giving me these intense looks that made my skin crawl. I texted my roommate under the table, asking her to call me with an emergency in 10 minutes. When the call came, I made my excuses and practically ran out of there, jumping in an Uber I'd already ordered. It wasn't until I was safe in my apartment that I really broke down. I was shaking and crying, overwhelmed by how terrifying the whole experience had been. What if Mark really had been planning to hurt me out in those woods? What if I hadn't been able to get away? I reported and unmatched him on Tinder immediately. Part of me wanted to go to the police, but I didn't have any real evidence that he'd done anything illegal. Just a gut feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something awful. It's been a week now, and I'm still rattled. I keep replaying everything in my head, wondering if I overreacted or if I really was in danger. But then I remember the fear I felt in that car, how wrong it all seemed, and I know I was right to trust my instincts. I've deleted all my dating apps now. The idea of meeting up with strangers from the internet seems far too risky. I know not every guy out there is a potential predator, but this experience has made me so much more cautious. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. Please be careful when meeting people online. Always tell someone where you're going, meet in public places, and trust your gut if something feels off. I'm grateful that my story didn't end tragically, but I know I got lucky. Stay safe out there, everyone. One day, I made a post about my favorite obscure indie band, and this guy named Kemper commented. He seemed to know even more about them than I did, which instantly impressed me. We started chatting in the comments, and then moved to private messages. At first, it was just fun conversations about music, but things quickly became more personal. Kemper was charming and attentive. He asked me all about my life and seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. I found myself opening up to him more and more. He told me he lived across the country, but the distance didn't seem to matter. We were connecting on such a deep level. Before I knew it, we were texting constantly throughout the day. Kemper always wanted to know what I was doing, who I was with, where I was going. At the time, I thought it was sweet that he cared so much. Now I realize it was the start of his controlling behavior. Things progressed quickly, and within a few weeks, Kemper was calling me his girlfriend. I was swept up in the excitement of it all. He'd send me long, poetic messages about how much I meant to him. He'd talk about our future together, how we were soulmates destined to be together forever. But then the jealousy started creeping in. If I took too long to respond to a text, Kemper would accuse me of ignoring him or talking to other guys. He'd demand to know exactly who I was with and what I was doing. If I went out with friends, he'd blow up my phone all night with angry messages. I tried to reassure him, but nothing seemed to help. He'd go from loving to furious in an instant. One minute he'd be telling me how much he adored me. The next he'd be calling me horrible names and accusing me of cheating. The worst part was, I started to believe him. Maybe I was a terrible girlfriend. Maybe I didn't deserve his love. I became paranoid about my every move, terrified of doing anything to upset him. Kemper didn't want me working because he said other guys would hit on me. He convinced me to quit my part-time job at a coffee shop. I was totally dependent on my parents financially, which made me feel even more trapped. I knew things weren't right, but I felt like I couldn't escape. Kemper would threaten to hurt himself if I ever left him. He'd send me pictures of pills or knives and say it would be my fault if he did something drastic. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. In the midst of all this, another guy named Ozzy started messaging me on Facebook. At first, I ignored him, not wanting to give Kemper any reason to be jealous. But Ozzy was persistent. He'd send me song lyrics and quotes that seemed to speak directly to what I was going through. Curiosity got the better of me, and I finally responded to Ozzy. He was different from Kemper, darker, more mysterious. He listened to my problems without judgment and seemed to understand exactly how I felt. Talking to him felt like a lifeline in the storm of my relationship with Kemper. But as I got to know Ozzy better, I realized he had his own set of issues. He'd send me disturbing artwork and talk about death and violence in a way that unsettled me. Sometimes he'd disappear for days, then resurface with frantic messages about how he couldn't live without me. I found myself caught between these two men, both pulling me in different directions. Kemper's jealousy and control were suffocating me, but Ozzy's unpredictability and dark nature frightened me. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Things came to a head one night when Kemper found out I'd been talking to Ozzy. He absolutely lost it, calling me every horrible name imaginable and threatening to expose private photos I'd sent him. I was sobbing, begging him to calm down, when suddenly Ozzy started blowing up my phone too. Ozzy was furious that I was still involved with Kemper. He said he thought we had something special and that I'd betrayed him. The messages from both of them were coming so fast I could barely keep up. My head was spinning and I felt like I couldn't breathe. In a moment of panic, I blocked both of them on every platform. I turned off my phone and curled up in bed, shaking and crying. I felt so stupid for getting myself into this mess. How had I let these online relationships consume my entire life? The next few days were awful. I was jumpy and paranoid, expecting one of them to show up at my door, even though they lived far away. I kept having nightmares about being trapped and unable to escape. My parents noticed something was wrong, but I was too ashamed to tell them what had happened. Slowly, I started to come out of the fog. I realized how much of myself I'd lost in these toxic relationships. I'd isolated myself from friends, quit my job, and neglected my hobbies. Everything had revolved around Kemper and then Ozzy. It's been a few months now, and I'm still working on rebuilding my life. I've reconnected with old friends and started seeing a therapist to work through the emotional trauma. I'm learning to trust my instincts and set boundaries. Sometimes I still get anxious when I think about what happened. Part of me is always waiting for one of them to resurface and try to pull me back in. But I'm stronger now. I know the red flags to watch for, and I'm committed to never letting anyone manipulate me like that again. I wanted to share my story as a warning to others. Online relationships can feel so real and intense, but it's easy to get caught up in a fantasy. You never truly know who's on the other side of the screen. Be careful who you trust with your heart and your personal information. If you're in a relationship that makes you feel scared, confused, or like you're losing yourself, please reach out for help. You're not alone, and you deserve so much better. It's not easy to break free, but I promise it's worth it. There's a whole world out there beyond the screen, and it's waiting for you to rediscover it. After a cozy Christmas dinner, we decided to take a late-night stroll through the nearby woods. The air was crisp and cold, our breath visible in small clouds as we walked hand in hand down the narrow dirt path. The moonlight filtered through the bare tree branches, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. Despite the chill, there was something magical about being out in nature on Christmas night. We had been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed an unusual tree just off the path. Its gnarled trunk twisted in an almost sculptural way, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I pulled out my phone to snap a quick photo, the flash briefly illuminating the darkness around us. That's when I saw it. A car parked further down the path, half hidden behind some bushes. It seemed so out of place in the middle of the woods at night. "Hey, do you see that car?" I whispered to my partner, pointing ahead. We approached cautiously, curiosity mixed with a growing sense of unease. It was an older model sedan, dark-colored and muddy. The windows were fogged up, making it impossible to see inside. There were no other cars or people around, just this lone vehicle on a deserted forest path late on Christmas night. "Hello? Is anyone there?" my partner called out as we got closer. No response. The whole situation felt wrong. Why would someone drive out here and leave their car? Were they lost? In trouble? Or up to something sinister? A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air. I was about to suggest we turn back when movement caught my eye. A figure stepped out from behind a large oak tree about 20 feet away. My breath caught in my throat as I made out the silhouette of a man, tall and thin, just standing there staring at us. He didn't say a word or move, just stood perfectly still, watching us. Even in the dim light, I could see there was something off about his appearance. His clothes looked old and tattered, hanging loosely on his gaunt frame. But it was his face that truly unsettled me, pale and drawn, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Hello there," my partner said nervously. "Are you all right? Is this your car?" The man remained silent and motionless. A pit formed in my stomach as the silence stretched on uncomfortably. Every instinct was screaming at me to run. "We were just out for a walk and saw the car," I found myself babbling to fill the eerie quiet. "Didn't mean to disturb anyone. We'll just be on our way now." I tugged on my partner's arm, eager to put distance between us and this unsettling stranger. But as we turned to leave, I noticed more movement in my peripheral vision. When I looked back, the man had taken several steps closer without making a sound. How did he move so quickly and quietly? My heart was pounding now as we quickened our pace. I risked a glance over my shoulder and let out a small gasp. The man was following us, walking with an unnatural gliding gait. "He's coming after us," I hissed to my partner. "We need to run." We broke into a sprint, our feet pounding against the dirt path. Branches whipped at my face as we ran, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear ragged breathing behind us, getting closer. In a panic, I veered off the path, pulling my partner with me into the thick underbrush. We crouched low, trying to control our labored breathing as we listened for signs of pursuit. For several agonizing minutes, the forest was silent except for the pounding of my heart. Then we heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves. They paused near our hiding spot, and I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a whimper. Just when I thought we would be discovered, an owl hooted loudly nearby, startling us. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. We waited another 10 minutes to be sure before cautiously emerging. The path was empty, no sign of the man or the mysterious car. "What the hell was that?" my partner whispered shakily. I shook my head, still too scared to speak. We practically ran the rest of the way home, constantly looking over our shoulders. Once safely inside, doors locked and curtains drawn, we tried to make sense of what happened. Who was that man? Why was he out there alone on Christmas night? The image of his gaunt face and glowing eyes was burned into my memory. We debated calling the police, but what would we even say? We hadn't actually been attacked or threatened, just thoroughly creeped out by a silent stranger in the woods. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about being chased through dark forests by a nameless, faceless entity. We never saw the man or the car again, despite my anxious scanning of the tree line whenever we ventured out. Eventually, the intensity of the fear faded, but I still get chills thinking about that night. To this day, I have no explanation for what we encountered in the forest. Was it just a homeless person or someone having car trouble? Or something more sinister and supernatural? All I know is that I'll never forget the terror of being stalked through the dark woods on what should have been a peaceful Christmas night. I've avoided taking walks in the forest since then, especially after dark. My partner says I'm being paranoid, that it was probably just a weird but harmless encounter. But they didn't see the inhuman way that man moved or the hungry look in his glowing eyes. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can see a gaunt face peering in through the bedroom window. In my darkest moments, I wonder if we ever truly escaped that night. What if that thing is still out there, watching and waiting for another chance to hunt us through the shadows? I know it probably sounds crazy. Most days, I can convince myself it was just an odd experience blown out of proportion by fear and imagination. But late at night, when the wind whispers through the trees outside, I'm transported back to that moment of stark terror in the forest. And I wonder what else might be lurking in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the light. I still remember that deer hunting trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened nearly 20 years ago. It was November 2004, and I was 16 years old enough to go on my first real hunting trip with my dad and his buddy Frank up in northern Wisconsin. I'd been looking forward to it for months, eager to prove myself as a real hunter. We drove up early Saturday morning, the truck packed with our gear and rifles. The air was crisp and cold as we set out into the woods before dawn. Dad gave me some last-minute reminders about gun safety and staying quiet. I nodded seriously, determined not to mess this up. For the first few hours, we didn't see much besides some squirrels and birds. I was starting to get bored and restless when suddenly I caught a flash of movement through the trees. My heart started racing. Was it finally a deer? I raised my rifle, peering through the scope, but what I saw in my sights wasn't a deer at all. It was a person, another hunter, dressed in blaze orange, and his rifle was pointed directly at me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Was this guy about to shoot me? Had he mistaken me for a deer? I wanted to call out, to wave my arms, anything, but I was paralyzed with fear. The other hunter kept his rifle trained on me for what felt like an eternity. I could see his finger resting on the trigger. My hands started shaking so bad I was afraid I'd accidentally fire my own gun. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was my dad. He must have noticed something was wrong. He spoke in a low, calm voice. "Don't move. Stay absolutely still." I tried to tell him about the other hunter, but my voice came out as a strangled whisper. Dad peered in the direction I was looking, then slowly eased me back behind a large tree, positioning himself in front of me. "Okay, we're going to stay right here for a bit," he said quietly. "Just breathe. Everything's gonna be fine." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the image of that rifle pointed at me. What if the guy decided to take the shot? What if he was some kind of maniac? My mind raced with horrible possibilities. We stayed hidden behind that tree for at least 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. I kept expecting to hear a gunshot at any moment, but gradually the woods grew quiet again. Finally, Dad risked a look around the tree. After a long moment, he relaxed slightly. "I think he's moved on," he said. "Let's head back to the truck, nice and slow." My legs felt like jelly as we made our way through the forest. Every snapping twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified of seeing that orange-clad figure again. When we got back to our meeting spot, we found Frank already there waiting for us. He looked concerned when he saw our faces. "What happened to you two? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. Dad explained the situation as I slumped against the truck, still shaky with leftover adrenaline. Frank listened with a furrowed brow, then suddenly his eyes went wide. "Oh shit," he said. "I think that might have been me you saw." I stared at him in disbelief. Frank went on to explain that he'd been tracking a big buck and had gotten turned around in the woods. He'd lost his radio, so he couldn't contact us. When he'd spotted movement, he'd raised his rifle to look through the scope, not realizing it was me he was seeing. "I'm so sorry, kid," Frank said, looking genuinely distressed. "I would never actually point my gun at a person. I was just trying to get a better look through the scope. I feel awful." Part of me wanted to be mad at Frank, but mostly I just felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It hadn't been some crazed stranger after all, just a stupid misunderstanding. Dad clapped Frank on the shoulder. "No harm done, buddy, but maybe we should all stick a little closer together from now on." We decided to call it a day after that. None of us were really in the mood for more hunting. On the drive home, Dad and Frank tried to lighten the mood with hunting stories and jokes, but I was quiet, still processing everything. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the incident in my mind. Even knowing it was just Frank, I couldn't shake how terrifying it had felt in the moment. The image of that gun barrel pointed at me was seared into my brain. It took me a long time to get to sleep that night, and for weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about being hunted through dark woods by faceless men with guns. I did eventually go hunting again with Dad and Frank, but I was never quite as excited about it as I had been before. That day in the woods had shown me just how quickly things could go wrong, how thin the line was between a routine hunting trip and potential tragedy. To this day, whenever I see someone handling a gun, even in completely innocent circumstances, I get a little jolt of that old fear. I know it's irrational, but I can't help it. That moment of terror in the woods left a mark on me that's never fully faded. I'm grateful nothing worse happened that day, but it was a harsh lesson in how dangerous hunting can be, even when everyone is trying to be safe and responsible. It's a memory that still haunts me sometimes, all these years later, a reminder of how quickly life can change in an instant, and how important it is to always be aware of your surroundings. I've never told many people about what happened that day. It's not exactly a heroic hunting story, but I think it's important to talk about the scary moments too, not just the triumphant ones, because sometimes those are the experiences that teach us the most valuable lessons. So that's my story, the day I thought I was about to die in the Wisconsin woods, only to find out it was all a misunderstanding. It might not be the most exciting hunting tale, but it's one I'll certainly never forget. My wife and I had been planning a camping trip with our kids for weeks. We wanted to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city and spend some quality time together as a family. We decided on a remote beach about 3 hours from our home. It seemed perfect, secluded and peaceful. We packed up our minivan with all our gear, tents, sleeping bags, coolers full of food and drinks. The kids were so excited, bouncing around in the back seat as we drove. Our rescue dog Parmesan was coming too. We'd adopted her about a year ago from a shelter. She'd been rescued from a dog-fighting ring and was pretty skittish at first, but had really bonded with our family over time. When we arrived at the beach, it was even more beautiful than we'd imagined. Pristine white sand, crystal clear water, not another soul in sight. We set up our tents near some trees at the edge of the beach, made a fire pit, and spent the afternoon swimming and building sand castles with the kids. As the sun started to set, we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows over the fire. The kids were exhausted from all the swimming and fresh air, so we tucked them into their sleeping bags pretty early. My wife and I stayed up a bit later, sitting by the dying embers of the fire and enjoying the peacefulness. Parmesan was curled up nearby, keeping watch as always. It must have been close to midnight when I woke up suddenly. At first I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it. Footsteps crunching on the sand, getting closer to our campsite. My heart started racing. Who else could be out here at this time of night? I quietly unzipped the tent and peeked out. In the dim moonlight, I could make out a man's figure approaching. He was tall and thin, and seemed to be stumbling a bit as he walked. Drunk, maybe. I hoped he was just another camper who'd gotten lost, but as he got closer, I saw the glint of metal in his hand. A knife. Oh, God. I frantically shook my wife awake, whispering urgently for her to keep quiet and get the kids up. She saw the panic in my eyes and immediately understood something was very wrong. Just then, Parmesan started growling low in her throat. The man was only about 20 feet from our tents now. I could smell alcohol on him as he slurred, "Come on out, folks. I know you're in there. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." My mind was racing. Should we try to reason with him, make a run for it, fight back somehow? We were miles from anywhere, no cell service. The kids were crying softly, terrified. The man was right outside our tent now. "I said come out," he yelled, slashing at the tent with his knife. The fabric ripped open and suddenly he was inside, waving the blade wildly. "Give me all your money and valuables now or I start cutting," he snarled. I put my hands up, trying to stay calm. Okay. Just please don't hurt my family. I'll give you whatever you want." But as I reached for my wallet, Parmesan erupted into action. With a vicious growl, she launched herself at the intruder, clamping her powerful jaws around his knife arm. He screamed in pain and shock, the knife clattering to the ground. "Run!" I yelled to my wife and kids. We burst out of the tent, Parmesan still latched onto the man's arm as he flailed and yelled. We sprinted across the sand towards our minivan, the man's curses echoing behind us. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as I tried to unlock the doors. Just as I got them open, I heard Parmesan yelp in pain. The bastard must have kicked her or hit her somehow. "Parmesan, come!" I yelled. To my immense relief, I saw her bounding towards us through the darkness. We all piled into the van, Parmesan jumping in last. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, tires spinning in the sand before we found traction. As we sped away, I saw the man staggering after us in the rearview mirror, clutching his bleeding arm. I drove like a maniac down the dark, winding coastal road, checking constantly to make sure we weren't being followed. After about 20 minutes of white-knuckle driving, we came to a small gas station, the first sign of civilization we'd seen. I pulled in, hands still shaking. "Stay in the car and lock the doors," I told my family, as I ran inside to use the phone and call the police. The cashier looked alarmed at my wild-eyed, disheveled appearance, but let me use the phone. I quickly explained what had happened to the 911 dispatcher. They said they'd send officers to the beach right away, and to our location as well. As I hung up, movement outside caught my eye. A beat-up pickup truck was pulling into the gas station. My blood ran cold as I recognized the driver. It was him. How the hell had he found us? I ran back to our van, yelling at my wife to drive. We peeled out of the gas station, the pickup in hot pursuit. What followed was the most terrifying hour of my life. We flew down empty highways at 90 mph, the truck always right behind us. Every time I thought we'd lost him, he'd appear in the rearview mirror again. The kids were sobbing in the back seat. My wife was on the phone with 911 again, frantically updating them on our location. We'd gone almost 55 miles from the beach when I saw the flashing lights of police cars up ahead. Oh, thank God. As we got closer, the pickup suddenly veered off onto a side road and disappeared into the night. We pulled over, all of us shaking and crying with relief as the officers approached. Over the next few hours, we gave our statements, described the attacker, and tried to process what had happened. The police never caught the guy. They found our campsite trashed, but no sign of him. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining what might have happened if Parmesan hadn't been there to protect us. That incredible dog saved our lives that night. She's always been affectionate, but now she hardly leaves our sides. I think she knows how much we need her. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe camping again. But I do know that I have a loyal, brave companion who will always have my back. Parmesan went from being a victim of violence to a hero that night. I only wish I could explain to her how grateful we are. I'll never forget that day near the beet fields. It was supposed to be just another lazy summer afternoon, but it turned into something I still can't explain. My best friend Amélie and I were hanging out by the edge of the beet fields, like we often did. It was our favorite spot to chill and talk about life, away from our nosy parents and annoying siblings. The sun was beating down, and the sweet, earthy smell of the beets filled the air. We were laughing about some stupid joke when I noticed a man walking towards us from the direction of the fields. At first, I didn't think much of it, probably just a farmer or something, but as he got closer, I felt a chill run down my spine despite the heat. Something about him just felt off. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that seemed way too heavy for the weather. His face was gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare right through me, and the way he moved was strange, sort of jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I nudged Amélie and nodded towards the man. She tensed up as soon as she saw him. We both sensed that something wasn't right. When he was about 20 feet away, the man called out to us in accented English. "Hello there. Beautiful day, isn't it?" I was immediately on edge. Why was he speaking English in rural France? And his accent was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite American or British, but something else entirely. Bonjour," I replied cautiously in French. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, you must be local boys. How wonderful. Tell me, do you come here often?" His gaze kept darting between us and the beet field behind us. It was making me seriously uncomfortable. "Sometimes," I said vaguely, not wanting to give him any information. "We should probably be going now." I started to stand up, but he quickly stepped closer, holding out his hands. "Oh no, please don't leave on my account. I was hoping you could help me with something, actually." Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place. Amélie gripped my arm tightly. "You see, I'm quite fascinated by these beet fields," the man continued, gesturing behind us. "Such an interesting crop, don't you think? Would you mind taking a look and telling me what you see?" I frowned, confused. "What do you mean? It's just beets." He shook his head emphatically. "Oh no, I think there's much more than that. Why don't you turn around and look closely? I'm sure you'll see something special." My heart was pounding. Why was he so insistent that we look at the field? What did he think was there? Or was he just trying to get us to turn our backs on him? Really, we need to go, I said more firmly, pulling Amélie to her feet. The man's demeanor instantly changed. His eyes narrowed and his mouth twisted into a snarl. "Look at the field, boy," he growled. "Look at it now." Pure terror shot through me. I shoved Amélie behind me and started backing away. "Leave us alone," I shouted. "We're leaving." He lunged forward with inhuman speed, his arms stretching out impossibly long to grab at me. I yelped and stumbled backwards, nearly falling. "Run!" I yelled to Amélie. We took off sprinting across the field, the man's angry shouts echoing behind us. I risked a glance back and my blood ran cold. The man was pursuing us, but his movements were all wrong. He seemed to glide over the ground, his limbs bending at unnatural angles, and his face, it was changing, morphing into something that barely looked human. We ran faster than I thought possible, my lungs burning and legs aching. I could hear the thing getting closer, strange clicking and hissing noises mixing with its enraged howls. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, we burst out of the field onto the main road. Cars whizzed by, and I frantically waved my arms, screaming for help. A delivery van screeched to a halt beside us. The driver took one look at our terrified faces and threw open the passenger door. "Get in, quick!" he yelled in French. We dove into the van and the driver sped off, tires squealing. I twisted around to look out the back window, dreading what I might see. But the field was empty. The man, or whatever he was, had vanished. We spent the next hour huddled in the van, shaking and babbling our story to the confused but kind driver. He dropped us off at the police station, where we gave statements about the strange man who had chased us. The police searched the area, but found nothing. They concluded it was probably just some creep trying to scare us. But they didn't see what we saw. They didn't feel the overwhelming wrongness of that thing. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about gliding figures and stretching limbs. I couldn't go near the beet fields without panicking. Amélie and I barely talked about it, but I could see the same haunted look in her eyes. To this day, I don't know what really happened. Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by heat and fear? An elaborate prank gone too far? Or something truly supernatural that defies explanation? All I know is that I'll never forget the soul-deep terror I felt as we ran for our lives that day. And sometimes, when I catch a whiff of beets, I swear I can hear that unearthly voice growling, "Look at the field, boy." I don't know what we would have seen if we had looked. And honestly, I never want to find out. I'm still shaken as I write this, trying to make sense of what happened. It was around 8 p.m. when Chippy and I set out on our usual trail. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I wasn't worried. I knew these woods like the back of my hand after spending so many summers here. About 20 minutes into our walk, I noticed Chippy getting antsy. Her ears were perked up, and she kept looking behind us, letting out little whines. I figured she'd just caught the scent of a rabbit or something. But then I heard it too, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. My heart started racing as I spun around. Through the trees, I could make out 3 figures approaching us on the path. As they got closer, I realized they were guys around my age, maybe a bit older. Something about the way they were walking made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I called out a hesitant, "Bonsoir," but they didn't respond. They just kept coming closer, spreading out to block the path. That's when I noticed one of them had something in his hand, the blade of a knife glinting in the fading daylight. Everything happened so fast after that. The guy with the knife lunged at me and I stumbled backwards, tripping over a tree root. But before he could reach me, Chippy sprang into action. She's not a big dog, just a scrappy little terrier mix. But in that moment, she was ferocious. She latched onto the guy's arm, snarling and shaking her head. He yelled in pain and dropped the knife. I scrambled to my feet as the other two guys rushed forward. That's when I noticed they were wearing masks. One looked like a wolf, the other like some kind of bird. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I took off running down the path, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear Chippy's barking behind me, then the sound of her paws on the dirt as she caught up. The shouts of the masked guys echoed through the trees as they gave chase. I've always been a decent runner, but I've never run like I did that night. Pure adrenaline and fear propelled me forward. I veered off the main path, hoping to lose them in the denser part of the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. Chippy was right on my heels, occasionally glancing back and growling. I could hear our pursuers crashing through the woods behind us, but I didn't dare look back. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to keep going. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. To my horror, I realized I'd run in a circle. I could see the lights of my grandparents' house in the distance, but between us and safety was another stretch of dark forest. I hesitated for a split second, trying to catch my breath and decide which way to go. That's when I heard a blood-curdling howl pierce the night air. It sounded close, too close. My blood ran cold as I realized it had come from one of our masked pursuers. Without thinking, I scooped up Chippy and made a mad dash for the house. I could hear heavy footsteps and labored breathing right behind us. Just as we reached the edge of my grandparents' yard, something snagged the back of my shirt. I stumbled but managed to stay on my feet. Chippy squirmed out of my arms and spun around, teeth bared. There was a yelp of pain and the grip on my shirt released. I didn't stop to see what happened. I just ran full tilt for the back door, Chippy right behind me. I burst into the kitchen, slamming and locking the door behind us. My grandparents came running at the commotion. I was gasping for air, unable to get the words out to explain what had happened. I just pointed frantically towards the woods. My grandfather grabbed his shotgun and went to check outside while my grandmother tried to calm me down. When he came back in, he said he hadn't seen anyone, but he'd call the police just in case. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. Who were those guys? Why were they wearing masks? What would have happened if Chippy hadn't been there to protect me? The questions swirled in my mind as I tried to recount the story to my grandparents and then to the police when they arrived. They searched the area but didn't find any sign of the masked men. The officer suggested they might have been some local kids playing a prank, but that didn't explain the knife. And that howl, it still echoes in my nightmares. In the days that followed, I kept replaying every detail in my mind. The glint of the knife, the snarling wolf mask, the sound of footsteps right behind me. I jumped at every little noise and couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods. Chippy stuck to me like glue, as if she could sense my lingering fear. I've always loved that little dog, but after that night, our bond feels unbreakable. She saved my life, no question about it. It's been a few weeks now, and I'm back home in the city. But I can't shake the feeling that something truly sinister was going on in those woods. Every time I close my eyes, I see those masks and hear that inhuman howl. I've scoured local news sites trying to find any reports of similar incidents, but there's nothing. It's like it never happened. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I look at Chippy, at the little scar on her ear from where she bit the guy with the knife, and I know it was real. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened that night. Were they just some messed up guys looking to hurt someone? Or was it something else? All I know is that I'll never look at a dark forest the same way again, and I'll never stop being grateful for my brave little dog who faced down the monsters in the night. The drive out to the forest was uneventful. We chatted and joked around, blasting music with the windows down. As we got further from civilization, the roads became rougher and the trees grew denser. By the time we reached the trailhead parking lot, we were deep in the wilderness. We shouldered our heavy backpacks and set off down the trail, aiming for a remote camping spot Jake had read about online. It was a beautiful hike. The forest was lush and green, birds were chirping, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. After a couple hours of hiking, we veered off the main trail onto a less defined path. "This should lead us to that secluded campsite," Jake said, checking the map on his phone. "It's pretty far out, but it's supposed to have an amazing view." As we pushed deeper into the forest, an uneasy feeling started to creep over me. The trees seemed to press in closer, blocking out more of the sunlight. The cheerful bird calls faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Finally, after what felt like hours of hiking, we emerged into a small clearing. A breathtaking vista of forested hills and distant mountains spread out before us. "Wow, this spot is perfect," Mike exclaimed. We quickly set up our tents and got a campfire going as the sun began to set. Sitting around the fire, roasting hot dogs and sharing stories, my earlier uneasiness melted away. This was exactly the peaceful getaway we had hoped for. As night fell, we decided to do some stargazing before bed. The sky out here was incredibly dark, with more stars than I'd ever seen before. We lay on our backs, pointing out constellations and watching for shooting stars. That's when I first noticed the strange light. It was just a faint glow at first, barely visible through the trees. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was definitely there, a soft, pulsing light somewhere in the forest. "Hey guys, do you see that?" I asked, pointing towards the light. Jake and Mike both looked where I was pointing. "Huh, that's weird," Jake said. "Maybe it's just the moon reflecting off something?" But there was no moon out tonight, and as we watched, the light seemed to grow brighter, taking on an unnatural blue-green tinge. "Should we go check it out?" Mike suggested. I hesitated. Part of me was curious, but a stronger instinct was screaming at me to stay put. "I don't know, it's pretty dark out there. Maybe we should wait until morning." Jake and Mike agreed, though they both kept glancing towards the light. We stayed up a while longer, but eventually the long hike caught up with us, and we turned in for the night. I had trouble falling asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that eerie glow burned into my retinas. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, no crickets chirping or owls hooting, just a heavy, oppressive silence. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to the sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves right outside the tent. My heart pounding, I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The noises continued. It sounded like something large moving around our campsite. "Guys," I whispered urgently. "Wake up!" Jake stirred groggily. "What? What's going on?" "Shh! Listen, there's something out there." We all held our breath, listening intently. The noises had stopped. Then suddenly, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the night. It sounded inhuman, a high-pitched wail that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What the hell was that?" Mike hissed. Before anyone could answer, we heard heavy footsteps running past our tent, branches snapping as whatever it was crashed through the underbrush. Then silence fell once again. None of us slept for the rest of the night. We huddled in our sleeping bags, jumping at every little sound. As soon as the first gray light of dawn appeared, we scrambled out of the tent. The campsite looked normal at first glance, but as we looked closer, we noticed disturbing details. Deep gouges in the earth, like something had been dragging heavy claws through the soil, and several of the trees at the edge of the clearing had huge strips of bark torn away, leaving pale wounds in the trunks. "Guys, I really think we should get out of here," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Jake nodded emphatically. "Yeah, let's pack up and go. This is getting too weird." As we hurriedly broke down our campsite, Mike wandered over to examine the damaged trees. He reached out to touch one of the exposed trunks. "Mike, don't," I started to say, but it was too late. The moment his fingers made contact with the bare wood, he went rigid. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he started mumbling incoherently. Jake and I rushed over, calling his name, but it was like he couldn't hear us. He swayed on his feet, still muttering strange syllables under his breath. We managed to guide him away from the trees and sit him down. After a few minutes, he blinked and seemed to come back to himself. What happened?" he asked, looking dazed and confused. "You tell us," Jake said. "You touched that tree and started acting really weird." Mike's brow furrowed. "I don't remember. The last thing I recall is waking up in the tent." This was getting way too freaky. We finished packing in record time, all of us eager to get the hell out of there. But as we shouldered our backpacks and turned to leave, we realized we had a problem. None of us could remember which way we had come from. The path we had followed yesterday seemed to have vanished overnight. We wandered in circles for what felt like hours, growing increasingly panicked as we failed to find any sign of the trail. "This doesn't make any sense," Jake said, frustration evident in his voice. "We can't have gotten that turned around." As we pushed through a particularly dense patch of underbrush, we suddenly emerged into another small clearing. And that's when we saw it. A tall metal barrier, stretching as far as we could see in both directions, cutting straight through the forest. We all froze, staring in disbelief. "What the hell?" I whispered. The barrier looked old and weathered, covered in moss and vines, but it was unmistakably man-made, smooth sheets of metal riveted together, at least 15 feet high. "I don't understand," Mike said. "This wasn't here yesterday. We would have noticed something like this on our hike in." Jake pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. The GPS wasn't working either. As we stood there trying to make sense of what we were seeing, we heard a twig snap behind us. We whirled around to see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, a tall, gaunt man with wild eyes and matted hair. He was dressed in tattered clothes that looked decades out of date. For a long moment, we all just stared at each other in shock. Then the strange man spoke, his voice rough and raspy like he hadn't used it in years. "You shouldn't be here. This area is restricted. They'll be coming soon." Before we could react, he turned and melted back into the forest, leaving us stunned and terrified. We didn't waste any time after that. We picked a direction and started running, no longer caring about finding the trail. We just knew we had to get away from that place as fast as possible. I'm not sure how long we ran. Everything was a blur of trees and panic. Somehow, miraculously, we eventually stumbled onto a dirt road. We followed it until we reached a small town where we were able to call for help. To this day, I still can't explain what happened out there in those woods. We reported our experience to the Forest Service, but they claimed there was no record of any metal barrier in that area. When we tried to show them on a map where we had been, none of the landmarks matched up. It was like that entire section of forest didn't exist. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just some kind of shared hallucination. But then I remember the terror I felt, the strange light, the inhuman scream. It all felt too real. Whatever we encountered out there, I know one thing for certain. I'm never going camping again. One slow afternoon, Phil came up to me while I was wiping down tables. He had this excited look on his face as he told me about an amazing job opportunity. Apparently, he had a friend who owned some luxury apartments downtown and was looking for a part-time property manager. The pay was way better than what I was making at the diner, plus it came with a free studio apartment. It sounded almost too good to be true, but Phil seemed so genuine about wanting to help me out. He said his friend was out of town, but he had a key and could show me one of the units that evening after my shift. I was hesitant at first. It felt a little odd to go with my boss to look at an apartment. But Phil insisted it was totally above board and professional. He even suggested I bring a friend along if it made me more comfortable. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut and said no. But I was struggling financially, and the idea of a better job with free housing was so tempting. I told myself I was being paranoid. Phil had always been nice and never acted inappropriate. So I agreed to go check out the apartment after work. My shift ended around 8 p.m. Phil said he needed to run home and grab the keys, so he'd pick me up in about 30 minutes. While I waited, I started to feel uneasy again. On impulse, I texted my roommate to let her know where I was going and who I was with, just in case. I also grabbed a small paring knife from the diner kitchen and slipped it up my sleeve. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but something in me wanted that extra sense of security. Phil pulled up right on time in his beat-up old Chevy. As I got in, he seemed a little on edge, fidgeting with the radio and avoiding eye contact. I chalked it up to him being in a rush. We headed out of town, which surprised me. I thought the apartments were supposed to be downtown. Oh, did I say downtown? Phil laughed nervously. I meant just outside of town. It's this new development, really nice area. That set off major alarm bells, but I didn't know what to do. We were already on the highway, going pretty fast. I casually mentioned that my roommate was expecting me home soon, hoping it might deter him if he had bad intentions. Phil just grunted and kept driving. After about 20 minutes, he turned off onto a dark side road. My heart was pounding now. This definitely wasn't the way to any new apartment complex. The houses got fewer and farther between until we were surrounded by thick woods. Phil? Where exactly are we going? I tried to keep my voice steady. He glanced at me, a weird glint in his eye. Just a little detour. There's someplace special I want to show you first. I knew then that I was in serious trouble. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation safely. I subtly moved my hand to feel the knife hidden in my sleeve, ready to use it if I had to. A few minutes later, Phil turned down a narrow dirt road. We came to a small clearing with a rickety old cabin. It looked abandoned, windows boarded up and weeds growing all around. Phil parked and turned off the engine. "Here we are," he said with this creepy enthusiasm. "What do you think? Nice and private, right?" I felt sick to my stomach. This was clearly some kind of hookup spot he'd used before. I had to get out of there fast. "Actually, Phil, I'm not feeling great," I said, faking a cough. "I think I'm coming down with something. Maybe we should do this another time." He frowned, reaching over to put his hand on my thigh. "Aw, come on, don't be like that. We drove all this way. Let's go check out the cabin, have a little fun." I jerked away from his touch. No thanks. I want to go home, now. Phil's friendly demeanor vanished. His face hardened as he grabbed my arm roughly. Don't be such a tease. You knew what this was about. Panic surged through me. I yanked my arm free and fumbled for the door handle, but he grabbed me again. Without thinking, I whipped the knife out of my sleeve and held it up. Back off, I yelled, my voice shaking. I swear I'll use this if you touch me again. Phil's eyes went wide with shock. He clearly wasn't expecting me to be armed. He held up his hands, trying to look non-threatening. Whoa, easy there. No need to get crazy. I was just joking around, that's all. I kept the knife pointed at him, my hand trembling. Take me home right now, or I'm calling the police. For a tense moment, I thought he might try to overpower me anyway, but then he slumped back in his seat with a frustrated sigh. Fine, have it your way. Stupid bitch, he muttered. The drive back was the longest 30 minutes of my life. I kept the knife out the whole time, terrified Phil might try something again. He fumed silently, shooting me dirty looks. When we finally got back to town, I made him drop me off at a busy gas station instead of my apartment. As soon as he drove away, I broke down sobbing with relief. I reported what happened to the police, but since nothing had technically occurred, they said there wasn't much they could do. I quit my job at the diner immediately. For weeks afterwards, I jumped at every sound and couldn't sleep without the lights on. It's been a year, and I still get anxious thinking about how differently things could have gone that night. I'm so grateful I listened to my instincts and brought that knife. I hate that there are men out there like Phil, abusing their position of authority to prey on young women. I hope sharing my story might help someone else trust their gut and stay safe if they ever find themselves in a similar situation. Always better to be cautious than to become a victim. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. It all started about a year ago when I was 17, working a dead-end job at a factory in Essex. I felt so lost and directionless, like I was just going through the motions day after day. My coworkers were always taking the piss out of me for being quiet and awkward. I tried not to let it get to me, but deep down, it really stung. One day after a particularly rough shift, I was walking home feeling proper miserable when I noticed this building I'd never paid attention to before. There was a sign out front advertising free personality tests. I don't know what came over me, but on impulse I decided to go in. Looking back, I think I was just desperate for something, anything, to change in my life. As soon as I walked in, this bloke called Alan greeted me like we were old mates. He had this intense energy about him, but in a way that made you want to impress him. When I mentioned feeling stuck in life, his eyes lit up, and he said their program could help me unlock my true potential. Before I knew it, I was sitting down to take their personality test. The questions were dead weird, asking about all sorts of personal stuff. But Alan kept reassuring me it was all part of the process. When I finished, he looked over my results with this concerned expression. He told me I had severe personality deficiencies, but that their courses could sort me out. I know it sounds mad, but in that moment I actually felt relieved, like finally someone understood what was wrong with me and could help. Alan started lending me all these books and having me watch these bizarre training videos. At first it was just basic self-help stuff, but it quickly got into some proper strange territory. They kept banging on about thetans and past lives and all this sci-fi sounding rubbish. But the way Alan explained it made it seem so profound and revolutionary. I started spending all my free time at the center. doing these intense counseling sessions they called auditing. They had me hold onto these metal cans while answering deeply personal questions. Sometimes I'd be there for hours, feeling completely drained afterwards. But Alan always praised me for my progress, saying I was advancing faster than most. The more involved I got, the more they pushed me to cut ties with suppressive persons in my life. They made me question everything about my upbringing and relationships. I started seeing my parents as holding me back from reaching my full potential. I even got into huge rows with them, accusing them of trying to suppress me when they expressed concerns. I was spending nearly all my wages on their courses and materials. Alan kept saying I was on the verge of a major breakthrough, but I just needed to invest a bit more. He talked about these higher OT levels where I'd gain superhuman abilities. It sounds balmy now, but at the time I was completely under their spell. I started to develop this massive ego, thinking I was superior to everyone around me. I'd get into arguments at work, lecturing my co-workers about how they were all blind to the truth. I lost pretty much all my mates during this time, but I didn't care. I felt like I was part of something bigger, more important. Things came to a head when my parents staged an intervention. They'd done research and showed me all this information about the dark side of Scientology, the abuse, the exploitation, the ruined lives. At first I was furious, accusing them of spreading N-theta. But as they kept talking, sharing stories of other people who'd been through similar experiences, something finally clicked. I realized with horror how much I'd changed, how I'd pushed away everyone who cared about me. I saw clearly for the first time how Alan and the others had manipulated me, playing on my insecurities and desperation. It was like a fog lifting from my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, feeling sick at how easily I'd been duped. The next day, I went to the center to confront Alan. As soon as I started questioning things, his whole demeanor changed. He got angry, threatening to declare me a suppressive person if I didn't get back in line. It was chilling to see how quickly he turned on me. I walked out of there and never went back. But the aftermath was rough. I felt so ashamed and stupid for falling for it all. I had to rebuild relationships with my family and the few friends who stuck by me. I'm still dealing with the financial fallout from all the money I sunk into their courses. The scariest part is how normal it all seemed while I was in it. They're experts at making you question your own perceptions, at isolating you from anyone who might snap you out of it. I shudder to think where I'd be now if my parents hadn't intervened when they did. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. If you're feeling lost or vulnerable, please be careful. These groups prey on people like that. They promise answers and belonging, but it's all a lie. Trust your gut and don't be afraid to question things that don't feel right. I was lucky to get out when I did, but I know many others aren't so fortunate. It's been almost a year now, and I'm still processing everything that happened. Some days are harder than others. I still have moments where I catch myself slipping back into that mindset, or where I miss the sense of purpose and community I thought I had. But then I remind myself it was all built on lies and manipulation. I've started seeing a therapist to work through it all, which has been really helpful. I'm also focusing on rebuilding my life, reconnecting with old friends, exploring new interests, and trying to figure out what I actually want to do with my future. It's not easy, but it feels so much more real and authentic than anything I experienced in Scientology. One of the hardest parts has been forgiving myself. I beat myself up for a long time about how I could have been so gullible. But I'm learning to have compassion for that lost, desperate kid I was. I try to channel my anger and regret into something positive by speaking out and warning others about the dangers of cults and high-control groups. I've even started volunteering with a support group for ex-members of various cults and extremist organizations. It's been eye-opening to see how similar many of our experiences are, despite the different ideologies involved. There's something really healing about connecting with others who truly understand what you've been through. Looking back, I can see now how perfectly positioned I was to be recruited. I was young, insecure, and searching for meaning. They offered simple answers to complex problems and a sense of belonging I was craving. It's scary how easy it is to fall into something like that when you're in a vulnerable place. I still have a lot of questions about my time in Scientology that I don't think I'll ever get full answers to. Like, how much did Alan and the others actually believe what they were selling? Were they all in on the con, or were some of them just as deceived as I was? I guess in the end it doesn't really matter. The damage was done either way. If there's one message I want to leave people with, it's this: trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to ask questions and challenge things that don't make sense. And most importantly, remember that real personal growth and self-improvement shouldn't come at the cost of your relationships, your finances, or your sense of self. I'm grateful every day that I got out when I did. I know I've got a long road ahead of me still, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on the right path, my own path, and that's worth more than any promises of superhuman abilities or cosmic secrets. My mom was, well, she wasn't really fit to be a mother. She was deep into drugs and would often leave me alone for days at a time while she went on benders. That night was no different. I hadn't seen her in almost 2 days and was getting hungry. There wasn't much food left in the apartment, just some stale cereal and spoiled milk. It was late, probably past midnight, but I couldn't sleep. My stomach was growling and I was scared being all alone in that dingy apartment. I remember staring out the window at the flickering streetlight, wishing my mom would come home soon. That's when I heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. At first I felt relieved, thinking it was finally my mom, but then I realized the footsteps sounded different, heavier, more aggressive. Before I could react, the door burst open with a loud crack. A large man with wild eyes stormed in. The smell of alcohol hit me immediately. He looked around frantically before his gaze landed on me. "There you are, you little brat," he snarled. I was paralyzed with fear as he strode across the room and roughly grabbed my arm. "Your junkie mom owes me money. You're coming with me until she pays up." I started crying and tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. He dragged me out of the apartment and down the stairs, ignoring my screams and struggles. Once outside, he clamped a hand over my mouth to muffle my cries. "Shut up or I'll kill you right here," he hissed in my ear. The threat only made me cry harder, but I stopped actively resisting. He marched me down the dark streets, muttering angrily to himself the whole time. I was sobbing uncontrollably, absolutely terrified of what was going to happen to me. Would I ever see my mom again? Was this man really going to kill me? We had gone several blocks when suddenly I heard rapid footsteps approaching from behind. My captor must have heard them too, because he whirled around, still gripping my arm painfully. A man appeared out of the shadows. He was tall and lean, wearing a battered leather jacket. A lit cigarette dangled from his lips, illuminating his face in the darkness. "Let the kid go," he said in a low, gravelly voice. My captor sneered. Mind your own business, asshole. This doesn't concern you. The man took a long drag of his cigarette, then flicked it away. I'm making it my business. Last chance, let her go. It happened so fast. My captor shoved me to the ground and lunged at the stranger. But the man in the leather jacket was quicker. He ducked the wild punch and countered with a vicious uppercut that lifted my attacker off his feet. The big man crumpled to the ground, out cold. I stared in shock, unable to process what had just happened. The stranger knelt down beside me. "You okay, kid?" he asked gruffly. I nodded mutely, still trembling. He helped me to my feet. "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe." I hesitated, remembering all the warnings about not going with strangers. But this man had just saved me, and I was desperate to get away from my unconscious attacker. I took his offered hand. We walked quickly through the dark streets. The man kept glancing around nervously, as if worried we were being followed. After a few blocks, we came to a police station. "All right, kid, this is where I leave you," he said. "Go inside and tell them what happened. They'll take care of you." "Wait," I cried as he turned to go. "Who are you?" He paused and gave me a crooked smile. "Just a guy who was in the right place at the right time. Take care of yourself, kid." With that, he melted back into the shadows and was gone. I never even got his name. I went into the station and told the officers what had happened. They were kind to me and called Child Protective Services. That was the last night I ever spent in my mom's custody. The police searched for my mystery savior, but never found him. They said he likely had warrants out and didn't want to risk getting arrested. I often wonder what happened to him and why he chose to help me that night. It's been over 2 decades now, but I still think about him sometimes. The man with the cigarette who appeared out of nowhere and saved my life. I don't know where I'd be today if he hadn't intervened. Sometimes when I'm walking at night, I'll catch a whiff of cigarette smoke, and for just a moment, I'm that scared little girl again. But then I remember I'm safe now, thanks to a stranger's unexpected kindness. I've tried to pay it forward over the years, to honor what he did for me. I volunteer at a youth shelter and advocate for kids in the foster system. I want to be for them what that man was for me, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I still have nightmares sometimes about that night, the terror of being dragged through those dark streets, certain I was going to die. But then I remember the man appearing like some kind of guardian angel. In my dreams now, I see his face clearly in the glow of his cigarette, weathered and tough, but with kind eyes. I don't know if I'll ever fully get over the trauma of what happened, but I'm grateful every day that I'm still here, that I got a second chance at life. And it's all thanks to a nameless stranger who chose to get involved when he could have just walked away. Sometimes I wonder if he knows the impact he had, how he changed the entire course of my life with that one heroic act. I hope somehow he does. I hope he knows that scared little girl grew up to be okay, to be happy and loved, and that she's spending her life trying to make a difference for other kids the way he did for her. So if you're out there somewhere, cigarette man, thank you. Thank you for being brave when I couldn't be. Thank you for caring about a stranger. Thank you for saving my life. I matched with this guy named Jake on one of the apps. He seemed sweet and charming at first. We hit it off right away, messaging back and forth for hours. After a few days of chatting, we decided to meet up for coffee. I was nervous, but excited. The date went well, or so I thought. We talked and laughed, and there was definitely a spark there. At the end of the night, Jake leaned in to kiss me. It felt magical. We made plans to go out again the following weekend. Over the next few days, we texted constantly. Jake was attentive and flirty, telling me how beautiful I was and how much he was looking forward to seeing me again. I started to let my guard down, thinking maybe I'd finally found someone special. But then everything changed in an instant. The night before our second date, Jake sent me a text that made my blood run cold. "I know what you are. You're disgusting. How dare you try to trick me?" My hands shaking, I asked what he meant. His response was a barrage of hateful, transphobic messages. Somehow he'd found out I was trans, even though I'd planned to tell him myself when the time felt right. I tried to explain, to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. The sweet guy I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a raging monster. He called me horrible slurs and threatened to expose me to everyone. Terrified, I blocked his number and all his social media accounts. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next day I got home from work to find dozens of threatening voicemails and emails from Jake. Somehow he'd gotten my personal contact info. The messages were full of graphic descriptions of violence he wanted to inflict on me. He said he knew where I lived and worked, and that he was coming for me. My hands trembling, I called the police. They took a report but said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually showed up. I felt so helpless and afraid. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining Jake bursting through my door. The next morning, things got even worse. I woke up to find my car vandalized, slurs keyed into the paint, tires slashed. Jake had made good on his threat to find me. Panicking, I called out of work and stayed home, afraid to leave. I spent the day frantically researching how to protect myself, looking into restraining orders and security systems. Around midday, my phone pinged with a new email notification. It was from Jake. My heart pounding, I opened it. Inside was a photo of my childhood home, the house I grew up in before transitioning. The message said, "I know everything about you. You can't hide." I felt like I was going to be sick. How had he found that information? I'd worked so hard to keep my past private and secure. Shaking, I called my friend Megan, who works as a police dispatcher. I told her everything that had happened, barely able to get the words out through my tears. She promised to help however she could. Thanks to Megan, I was able to get an emergency protective order against Jake. She also arranged for extra patrols in my neighborhood. It helped me feel a little safer, but I was still on edge constantly. Over the next few days, the harassment continued. Jake created new accounts faster than I could block them. He left threatening notes on my car and in my mailbox. I was living in a constant state of terror, jumping at every sound and shadow. About a week after it all started, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My blood ran cold. I knew I'd locked it when I left that morning. Heart pounding, I called 911 and waited outside for the police to arrive and clear the place. Nothing was taken, but drawers had been rifled through and papers strewn about. On my bedroom mirror, written in what looked like lipstick, were the words, "I see you." That was the last straw. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear. The next day, I put in my 2 weeks' notice at work and started making plans to move out of state. It wasn't easy to uproot my whole life, but I knew it was necessary. I legally changed my name and got all new identification documents. I found a job in a new city and moved into a secure apartment building with 24/7 security. It's been about 6 months since I moved. So far, there's been no sign of Jake, but I still look over my shoulder everywhere I go. I have nightmares about him finding me again. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Be careful who you trust online. And if someone starts harassing or threatening you, don't wait. Get help immediately. I'm slowly rebuilding my life and trying to move past the trauma. But I'll never forget those terrifying weeks when my world was turned upside down by a man I thought I could trust. It's a harsh reminder that transphobia and hate are still very real dangers. To anyone else out there who's experienced something similar, you're not alone. Stay strong, stay safe, and don't be afraid to ask for help. We shouldn't have to live in fear just for being who we are. I first noticed him when he came in around 10 a.m. Tall guy, probably in his 40s, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and slacks. Nothing too out of the ordinary. He ordered a simple black coffee and sat down at one of the tables near the counter. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the morning went on, I started to feel uneasy. Every time I looked up from making drinks, his eyes were on me. Not just a casual glance, but an intense, unwavering stare. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then I noticed him holding up his phone, angled in my direction. Was he taking pictures of me? A chill ran down my spine. During a lull in customers, he approached the counter again. "Can I get a refill?" he asked, sliding his cup towards me. As I took it, he leaned in close, way too close, and said in a low voice, "You know, you have very delicate hands for a man. I bet you're not very strong, are you?" I froze, completely thrown off guard. What kind of question was that? I mumbled something non-committal and quickly moved away to refill his coffee, my hands shaking slightly. When I returned, he was still there, watching me with an unsettling smile. "So, what time do you get off work?" he asked casually, as if we were old friends. I'm not sure," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It varies." He nodded slowly, still smiling. "Well, maybe I'll stick around and we can grab a drink after your shift. I'd love to get to know you better." My stomach churned. I'm openly gay, and normally I don't mind friendly flirtation from customers. But this felt different, predatory, threatening. I politely declined and busied myself with wiping down the counter, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But he didn't. He lingered at the counter, peppering me with personal questions. Where did I live? Did I work out? Was I seeing anyone? With each question, I felt more and more trapped. I glanced at the clock, still 4 hours left in my shift. Finally, my coworker Jen came back from her break. Seeing my distress, she smoothly inserted herself into the conversation, giving me a chance to escape to the back room. I leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. When I emerged a few minutes later, the man was gone. But my relief was short-lived. As the day wore on, he kept coming back. Every hour or so, he'd reappear, order another coffee, and resume his creepy staring and uncomfortable comments. By the time my shift was nearing its end, I was a nervous wreck. What if he was waiting outside for me? The thought of walking to my car alone filled me with dread. I confided in Jen and our manager, explaining the situation. They were immediately concerned and supportive. "Don't worry," my manager assured me. "We'll make sure you get out safely." They devised a plan. Jen would walk out with me while our manager watched from the window. If the man appeared, they'd call the police immediately. It wasn't foolproof, but it made me feel a little better. As closing time approached, I kept glancing out the windows, searching for any sign of him. My palms were sweaty, my mouth dry. The last customer left, and we began our closing routine. I'd never been so scared to leave work before. Finally, it was time. Jen and I walked out together, my manager's eyes on us from inside. I scanned the parking lot, my heart pounding, and there he was, leaning against a car about 50 feet away. When he saw me, he straightened up and started walking towards us. "Hey," he called out. "I was hoping to catch you. How about that drink?" Jen stepped in front of me protectively. "He's not interested," she said firmly. "Please leave him alone." The man's friendly demeanor vanished in an instant, his face contorted with anger. "You little fuck," he spat. "You think you're too good for me?" I was paralyzed with fear, but Jen grabbed my arm and pulled me towards my car. "Get in," she hissed. "I'll stay with you until you drive away." As I fumbled with my keys, I saw the man advancing towards us, his fists clenched. But then a police siren wailed in the distance. My manager must have called them. The man hesitated, then turned and ran to his car. I practically fell into the driver's seat, my whole body shaking. Jen stood guard until I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man's car peel out in the opposite direction. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, terrified he might be following me. When I finally got home, I double-checked all the locks and collapsed on my bed, utterly drained. It's been a few days now, and he hasn't shown up at the coffee shop again. My co-workers and managers have been incredibly supportive, even offering to change my schedule if I wanted. But I can't shake the feeling of violation, the lingering fear. I jump at every unexpected noise, flinch when strangers get too close. I know I'm lucky it didn't escalate further, but the experience has left me shaken to my core. I never thought something like this would happen to me, especially not at work where I'm supposed to feel safe. It's opened my eyes to the vulnerability we all face, especially those of us in the LGBTQ+ community. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Trust your instincts. If someone makes you uncomfortable, speak up. And to my fellow service industry workers, look out for each other. I'm grateful for my co-workers who had my back that day. Without them, who knows what might have happened. I still have nightmares about that man's face, his angry words. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe at work again. But I'm trying to move forward, to not let fear control my life. It's a struggle, but I'm determined to reclaim my sense of security. To anyone who's experienced something similar, you're not alone. And to that man, wherever he is now, I hope he realizes the impact of his actions, the terror he caused. No one deserves to feel hunted, to have their personal space and safety violated like that. I don't know if I'll ever understand why he targeted me, or what his true intentions were, but I do know that I'm stronger than I thought, and I'm surrounded by people who have my back. That's what I'm trying to focus on as I heal from this terrifying experience. I'm originally from Vancouver, but I moved to the UK for grad school about 8 months ago. To save money, I found a flat share with 2 other students in a decent area of town. It wasn't fancy, but it felt safe enough. That false sense of security was shattered in an instant. It was a Tuesday night, and my flatmates were both out at a pub quiz. I had a big presentation the next day, so I decided to stay in and practice. Around 9 p.m., I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought maybe one of my roommates had come home early, but then I remembered they had texted saying they'd be out late. My heart started racing as I crept towards the kitchen. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just the old pipes making noise again. But as I got closer, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone rummaging through our cabinets. I froze, unsure of what to do. Should I confront them? Run? Call the police? Before I could decide, the kitchen door swung open, and there he was. A man I'd never seen before, holding a knife in one hand and, bizarrely, a bottle of Prosecco in the other. For a split second, we just stared at each other in shock. Then he lunged at me. I screamed and stumbled backwards, nearly tripping over my own feet as I ran towards my bedroom. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I could hear him pounding on the door, shouting something I couldn't understand through my panic. I scrambled for my phone, but in my haste, I knocked it off the nightstand and it slid under the bed. I dropped to the floor, desperately reaching for it, all too aware of the increasingly violent banging on my door. As my fingers finally closed around my phone, I heard a sickening crack. He was breaking through the door. I knew I only had seconds. In a moment of clarity, I remembered the fire escape outside my window. I'd always thought it was an eyesore, but now it was my only hope. I yanked open the window, the cool night air hitting my face as I climbed out onto the metal grating. I could hear him entering my room just as I started descending the stairs, taking them two at a time, praying I wouldn't slip. When I reached the ground, I started running. I had no plan, no destination in mind. I just knew I needed to get as far away as possible. I ran down the street, barefoot and still in my pajamas, gasping for air and fighting back tears. I spotted two men walking on the other side of the road, and throwing caution to the wind, I sprinted towards them, screaming for help. They looked startled, but as soon as I managed to choke out "intruder" and "knife," their expressions changed to concern and determination. One of them immediately called the police, while the other asked me to point out which building I'd come from. When I showed them, we saw a figure climbing down the fire escape. It was him. The two men, who I later learned were off-duty soldiers, didn't hesitate. They took off after him, shouting for him to stop. I stood there, shaking and sobbing, as I watched this surreal chase unfold. It felt like I was watching a movie, not something happening in real life. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the night air. They joined the pursuit, and soon after, I saw them leading the man away in handcuffs. An officer approached me, gently draping a shock blanket over my shoulders and asking if I was hurt. I shook my head, still unable to form words. She led me to an ambulance where paramedics checked me over, assuring me I was physically unharmed. The next few hours were a blur of police questions and statements. I learned that the man had broken in through our kitchen window, which we often left unlocked because it was on the second floor, a rookie mistake that could have cost me my life. But the most chilling revelation came the next day when the detective assigned to my case called me in for a follow-up interview. They had searched the man's home and found dozens of photos of me, leaving my apartment, shopping at the local Tesco, even sitting in lectures at university. He had been stalking me for months without my knowledge. The Prosecco bottle he was carrying. It was my favorite brand, the one I always bought for girls' nights with my flatmates. He knew my routines, my preferences, my life. The thought makes me sick to my stomach. It's been 3 weeks since that night, and I'm still struggling to process everything. I've moved out of the apartment and am staying with a friend until I can find a new place. I jump at every unexpected noise and can't bring myself to be alone in a room with the windows open. The police have assured me that he'll be locked away for a long time, but that doesn't erase the fear. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't heard him in the kitchen, if I hadn't remembered the fire escape, if those two men hadn't been walking by at that exact moment. I'm seeing a therapist now, trying to work through the trauma and anxiety. She tells me it's normal to feel this way, and that healing takes time. But how do you heal from something like this? How do you go back to normal when your sense of safety has been so thoroughly shattered? I'm writing this partly as a warning to others, especially young women living alone or in shared accommodations. Be vigilant, trust your instincts, and always, always lock your windows. But I'm also writing this for myself, hoping that putting it all down in words will help me make sense of it somehow. To the two men who helped me that night, if you're reading this, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. And to anyone else who's been through something similar, know that you're not alone. We're survivors, and we'll get through this, one day at a time. I don't know what the future holds, or if I'll ever feel completely safe again. But I'm still here, still fighting, still living. And for now, that has to be enough. The first club meeting I went to was pretty chill. Everyone seemed friendly enough, though I was still adjusting to speaking English all the time. As we were watching some episodes of a new series, I noticed this girl kept glancing over at me. She had dyed blue hair and was wearing a bunch of anime pins and patches. When the meeting ended, she came right up to me with a big smile. "Konnichiwa, I'm Neko-chan," she said in a high-pitched voice. "You're new here, right? I love your Attack on Titan shirt." I thanked her and introduced myself. She seemed nice enough at first, if a bit over-enthusiastic. We chatted for a few minutes about our favorite anime. She mentioned she was also new to the school, so I figured we were in the same boat as freshmen. Over the next couple weeks, I started noticing Neko-chan more and more around campus. She always waved excitedly when she saw me and would rush over to talk. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was just being friendly, right? But then things started getting weird. One day after class, I found a folded-up piece of paper stuck in the zipper of my backpack. It was a drawing of me as an anime character, but with cat ears and a tail. The style was actually pretty good, but something about it made me uncomfortable. At the bottom it said, "For my favorite senpai, Neko-chan." I didn't want to be rude, so the next time I saw her, I just said thanks for the drawing. She got super excited and started gushing about how she'd love to draw more of me. I tried to change the subject, but she kept bringing it back to how kawaii I was and how she wanted to capture my essence in her art. Things escalated quickly after that. Neko-chan started showing up outside all of my classes, even ones across campus from each other. She'd be waiting by the door to walk with me, chattering the whole time about anime or asking really personal questions. I started taking different routes to try and avoid her, but somehow she always found me. The drawings got more frequent too. I'd find them slipped into my books, my locker, even under the windshield wiper of my car, and they were getting more graphic, like seriously NSFW stuff featuring me in compromising positions. It was really freaking me out. I tried to distance myself from her, making excuses about being busy with schoolwork, but she just got more persistent. She'd blow up my phone with texts and calls at all hours. When I didn't respond, she'd send strings of sad emoji faces or angry messages accusing me of hating her. The breaking point came about a month ago. I was in the middle of a lecture when the classroom door burst open. It was Neko-chan, wearing a full-on magical girl cosplay outfit. She ran straight up to me, threw her arms around my neck, and tried to kiss me in front of everyone. I pushed her off and ran out of the room, completely mortified. As soon as I got back to my dorm, I called campus security and told them everything. They took it really seriously and said they'd look into it. A few days later, I got called into the dean's office. Turns out, Neko-chan wasn't even a student at all. She was only 15 years old and had been sneaking onto campus to stalk me. They'd caught her trying to break into my dorm room with a set of lockpicks. I was in shock. All this time, I thought she was just an overly enthusiastic fellow student. Finding out she was so young and had been lying about everything made me feel sick. The dean assured me she'd been banned from campus, and they were working with the police on further action. It's been a few weeks now, and I haven't seen or heard from Neko-chan since, but I still feel on edge all the time. I keep looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her blue hair and manic grin. I've had nightmares about her breaking into my room or jumping out at me from behind a bush. The whole experience has made me really wary of making new friends here. I know not everyone is like that, but it's hard to trust people now. I'm seeing a counselor to try and work through it all, but I still get panic attacks sometimes when I'm alone on campus. I never imagined something like this could happen to me. You always hear about stalkers and obsessive fans, but you never think it'll be you. I'm just trying to focus on my studies and get through the rest of the semester. But part of me is always wondering, is she still out there somewhere, watching me? Will I ever feel safe again? I guess the lesson here is to trust your instincts if something feels off about someone. And don't be afraid to ask for help if you're in an uncomfortable situation. I wish I'd spoken up sooner instead of trying to handle it on my own. Maybe then things wouldn't have gotten so out of control. Anyway, thanks for listening to my story. It feels good to get it off my chest, even if it still scares me to think about. I hope sharing this might help someone else recognize the warning signs if they're in a similar situation. Stay safe out there, everyone. I sank into the warm, bubbling water, feeling my muscles relax as I gazed up at the constellations. The farm stretched out around me, fields of corn and wheat, the old red barn, the chicken coop. Everything was still and calm. I closed my eyes, letting the gentle sound of the jets lull me into a state of tranquility. When I opened them again, something caught my eye at the edge of our property. There, between two young saplings we had planted last spring, was a dark figure. At first, I thought it must be a trick of the shadows, but as I focused, I realized with growing horror that it was unmistakably the silhouette of a person. My blood ran cold. The figure was completely motionless, standing unnaturally still as it faced directly towards me. I couldn't make out any features in the darkness, just the vague outline of a tall, thin form. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I found myself frozen in place, unable to look away. Seconds stretched into minutes as we remained locked in this terrifying standoff. My mind raced, trying to come up with some rational explanation. Maybe it was just a neighbor out for a late-night walk, but deep down, I knew that made no sense. Our closest neighbors were miles away, and no one in their right mind would be lurking at the edge of our property at this hour. Finally, survival instinct kicked in. Moving as slowly and quietly as I could, I eased myself out of the hot tub. My legs felt like jelly as I grabbed my towel, wrapping it tightly around myself. I backed towards the house, never taking my eyes off the motionless figure. My hand fumbled for the door handle, and I practically fell inside, slamming and locking it behind me. Heart pounding, I ran through the house, making sure every door and window was securely locked. I grabbed my cell phone, ready to call 911, but hesitated. What would I even say? I hadn't actually seen the figure do anything threatening. Would the police even respond to a vague report of someone standing on the edge of our property? Instead, I decided to keep watch. I positioned myself by the living room window, which had a clear view of where I'd seen the figure. To my horror, it was still there, in the exact same spot, completely motionless. I don't know how long I stood there, barely breathing, watching and waiting. It felt like hours. As the night wore on, my fear began to mingle with a growing sense of confusion and unease. Why wasn't the figure moving? What could it possibly want? The longer it stood there, the less human it seemed. No person could remain that still for so long. I considered calling my parents, but I didn't want to worry them when they were so far away. Besides, what could they do? I was on my own, and I had to handle this myself. Around midnight, something changed. I had been staring so intently at the figure that when it finally moved, I almost missed it. One moment it was there, and the next, it simply wasn't. I blinked hard, certain I must have dozed off for a second, but no matter how much I strained my eyes, I couldn't see any sign of movement or retreating form. It was as if the figure had simply vanished into thin air. I stayed by the window for another hour, scanning the property for any sign of the intruder. But there was nothing, just the quiet, moonlit farm. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I retreated to my bedroom. I pushed my dresser in front of the door and slept with a kitchen knife on my nightstand, jumping at every creak and groan of the old farmhouse. When morning came, I cautiously ventured outside. The world looked normal in the harsh light of day, birds singing, cows lowing in the pasture. I walked to the spot where I'd seen the figure, half expecting to find footprints or some other evidence. But there was nothing. The grass between the saplings was undisturbed, with no sign that anyone had stood there for hours the night before. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was a shadow, a trick of the light. Maybe I fell asleep in the hot tub and dreamed the whole thing. But deep down, I know what I saw. There was someone, or something, watching me that night. And the fact that I never saw it arrive or leave, that it stood so impossibly still for so long, makes me question whether it was human at all. I didn't tell my parents when they got home. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? But I've never used the hot tub at night again. And sometimes, when I'm outside after dark, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I find myself scanning the edges of our property, half expecting to see that motionless figure standing there once again. Living on a farm, you get used to the isolation. You learn to be self-reliant and not to scare easily. But that night shook me to my core. It made me realize how vulnerable we really are out here, miles from help. And it left me with questions I'll probably never be able to answer. What was that figure? What did it want? And most chillingly, will it ever come back? I still live on the farm, but things have changed. I'm more cautious now, always locking doors and keeping my phone close. I've installed security cameras and motion sensor lights around the property. But no matter how many precautions I take, I can't shake the memory of that night. The image of that silhouette is burned into my mind, a constant reminder that sometimes the things we can't explain are the most terrifying of all. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the stars are bright and the wind whispers through the cornfields, I find myself looking out towards those two saplings, and for just a moment, I swear I can see a shadow there, standing impossibly still, watching and waiting. In those moments, the fear comes rushing back, and I'm that terrified 18-year-old girl again, alone and vulnerable in the vast, dark expanse of our isolated farm. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe here again. But this is my home, and I refuse to be driven away by fear of the unknown. So I stay, and I watch, and I wonder. And I hope that whatever it was that visited our farm that night, it never decides to return. Because the next time, I might not be content to just watch from behind a locked door. The next time, I might just find the courage to confront it and finally get some answers. But part of me hopes that day never comes, because deep down, I'm afraid that the truth might be even more terrifying than the unknown. It all started when I was driving home from a late shift at the restaurant where I waitress. It was around 1 a.m., and the streets were eerily quiet. I was taking my usual route through a neighborhood I now know has a bad reputation, but at the time I was oblivious. Suddenly I spotted a small orange tabby cat dart into the road ahead of me. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes and pulled over. The poor thing looked scared, and I wanted to help it get safely to the sidewalk. I quickly got out, leaving my keys in the ignition like an idiot. As I approached the cat, I heard a faint click behind me. My blood ran cold as I turned and saw my car doors had automatically locked. My phone and purse were inside. I was alone on a dark street with no way to call for help. Panic set in as I realized how vulnerable I was. I looked around desperately, hoping to see someone I could ask for help. The streets were deserted, rows of dilapidated houses with boarded-up windows stretching into the darkness. Then I heard it, the soft whir of bicycle wheels approaching. My heart started racing as I saw 3 men on bikes emerge from the shadows, circling me slowly like vultures. They were muttering to each other and leering at me in a way that made my skin crawl. "Hey, baby, you lost?" one of them called out with a predatory grin. "We can help you out." I knew I had to get out of there fast. Without a word, I turned and ran as fast as I could down the street. I could hear them laughing and whooping behind me as they gave chase on their bikes. My legs were burning, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I darted down side streets randomly, trying to lose them. After a few blocks, I spotted a church up ahead and made a beeline for it, praying the door would be unlocked. By some miracle, it was. I slipped inside and shut the heavy wooden door behind me, listening intently. I could hear the men outside, their voices echoing in the night as they searched for me. I crouched down in a pew, trying to steady my breathing and figure out what to do next. The church was pitch black inside, except for a few flickering candles near the altar. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed cobwebs in the corners and a thick layer of dust on everything. It was clear this place hadn't been used in years. I don't know how long I huddled there in the darkness, jumping at every creak and shadow. It felt like hours. Eventually, the voices outside faded, and I worked up the courage to peek out. The street seemed empty, but I knew I couldn't stay in the church forever. Keeping to the shadows, I crept along the sidewalk, constantly looking over my shoulder. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to my car. Every rustle and distant sound made me flinch. After walking for what felt like miles, I came across a closed restaurant with a payphone outside. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial, but I managed to call a 24-hour locksmith service. The woman who answered sounded skeptical when I explained my situation, but said she'd send someone out. While I waited, I tried to hide behind a dumpster in the alley next to the restaurant. Every passing car made me tense up, afraid it was those men on bikes coming back. The minutes crawled by agonizingly slowly. Finally, after almost an hour, a van pulled up with Al's 24/7 locksmith painted on the side. An older man with a beard got out, looking annoyed. "You the one who called?" he grumbled. "Been driving all over looking for you. Almost gave up." I nearly cried with relief as I ran over to him. "Yes, thank you so much for coming. I can't tell you how grateful I am." He seemed to soften a bit when he saw how distraught I was. I quickly explained what had happened as we drove back to where I'd left my car. To my immense relief, it was still there and undamaged. The locksmith was able to get my car open in just a few minutes. As soon as I was safely inside with the doors locked, I broke down sobbing. The events of the night hit me all at once, and I was overwhelmed with fear, exhaustion, and thankfulness to have survived. I gave the locksmith all the cash I had in my wallet as a tip. He seemed concerned about leaving me alone and offered to follow me home to make sure I got there safely. I gratefully accepted. It wasn't until I was finally back in my apartment that I really processed how close I'd come to real danger. If I hadn't found that church, or if the locksmith hadn't come, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. I'm still rattled and having trouble sleeping. I keep replaying that night in my head, second-guessing every decision I made. Why did I stop for that cat? Why didn't I pay more attention to my surroundings? How could I have been so naive? I know I was incredibly lucky, and it could have ended much worse. I've since learned that the neighborhood I was in is notorious for violent crime, especially at night. As a newcomer to the city, I had no idea. This experience has definitely changed me. I'm much more cautious now and hyper-aware of my surroundings at all times. I've signed up for self-defense classes and bought pepper spray to carry with me. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others, especially young women in unfamiliar cities. Trust your instincts, be aware of your environment, and never let your guard down. What seems like an innocent good deed can quickly turn into a nightmare. I still love New Orleans and don't plan to leave, but I'll never look at the city the same way again. Those dark streets hold real dangers that I was blind to before. I'm just grateful I made it out unharmed and can share my story. Stay safe out there, everyone. I was still shaking as I sat down to write this. Even though it happened hours ago, I can't get the images out of my head. My friend Emma and I had been out drinking, probably more than we should have, but we needed to blow off some steam after another crappy week at the women's shelter. We were stumbling down the street, giggling and hanging on each other, when this guy approached us. He seemed friendly enough at first, asking if we wanted to check out this really cool temple nearby. In our tipsy state, it sounded like a fun adventure. The temple was just a few blocks away, tucked between some old brick buildings. As we got closer, I could hear faint music drifting out. The guy, I think he said his name was Michael, ushered us inside with a strange little smile. The interior was dimly lit, with candles flickering everywhere. Incense smoke hung thick in the air. There were colorful tapestries on the walls and plush cushions scattered around. A few other people were lounging about, swaying to the hypnotic music. At first, I was enchanted. It felt so mystical and otherworldly. Emma and I exchanged excited glances as we sank onto some cushions. Michael brought us glasses of some sweet-smelling drink. I took a sip and felt warmth spread through my body. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I started noticing things that made me uneasy. The way Michael was looking at us felt predatory, and some of the symbols on the wall tapestries seemed sinister somehow. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a chill ran down my spine. Michael sat down very close to us and started talking in a low, intense voice. At first it was just New Age spiritual stuff, but then he started making sexual comments that made my skin crawl. He kept touching Emma's arm and leg as he spoke. I saw her tense up. "You girls look like you could use some enlightenment," he purred. "I have something that will open your minds wide. It's a special blend. very potent, lets you see beyond the veil. Alarm bells were going off in my head. I grabbed Emma's hand and whispered that we should leave. But as I tried to stand up, the room started spinning. Whatever was in that drink was hitting me hard. Michael's face seemed to morph and stretch as he leaned in close. "Where are you going? The night is young. Don't you want to transcend your earthly forms?" His voice had taken on a strange, echoing quality. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. The other people in the room had gone still, staring at us with blank eyes. The music had changed to a low, throbbing drone that made my teeth ache. Emma tugged on my arm. "We need to go, now." Her voice was tight with fear. As we stumbled to our feet, Michael's demeanor changed completely. His face contorted into a snarl, and he lunged at us, grabbing Emma's wrist. "You ungrateful little sluts! You don't appreciate what I'm offering you." I reacted on instinct, shoving him as hard as I could. He stumbled back, crashing into a table of candles. In the chaos, Emma and I ran for the door. I could hear him screaming behind us, his voice inhuman. We burst out onto the street, gasping for air. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. We ran for blocks, not daring to look back. Finally, we collapsed in an alley, both of us shaking and on the verge of tears. "What the fuck was that?" Emma choked out between sobs. "Did you see his face at the end? It wasn't human." I nodded, unable to speak. The image of Michael's face twisting and stretching was burned into my mind. And those blank-eyed people, had they been drugged, hypnotized? Were they even real? As the adrenaline faded, I became aware of how weak and dizzy I felt. Whatever had been in that drink was still affecting me. Emma looked just as out of it. We managed to call an Uber to get back to the shelter safely. Now, hours later, I still can't shake the feeling of dread. What would have happened if we'd stayed? What kind of sick rituals go on in that place? I keep replaying every moment, trying to make sense of it all. The way Michael moved at the end, it was like watching a video glitch in real life. His limbs bent at impossible angles, and that scream, it still echoes in my head. No human throat could make a sound like that. I'm terrified to go to sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see flashes of symbols from those tapestries, twisted alien shapes that make my mind recoil. And underneath it all is that droning, pulsing sound that seems to vibrate in my bones. Emma is just as shaken up. We've agreed to go to the police in the morning, but I don't know what we'll tell them. It all sounds so insane when I try to put it into words. Will they even believe us? Part of me wants to go back in the light of day, to prove to myself that it was just a bad trip. But a deeper part knows that would be a terrible mistake. Whatever is going on in that temple, it's not of this world. I can't stop thinking about the other people we saw there. Were they victims too, or willing participants in whatever that was? Are they still there now, trapped in some drug-induced trance? The guilt is eating me alive. Every noise makes me jump. I'm convinced Michael is going to find us somehow, that he'll come bursting through the door with that inhuman shriek. I don't know how I'll ever feel safe again. I'm writing this all down partly to try and process it, and partly as a warning. If a stranger ever invites you to check out some cool temple, run the other way. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened tonight. Maybe it was just the alcohol and whatever was in that drink playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know that's not true. I saw something tonight that defies explanation, something ancient and evil that was never meant for human eyes. All I know for sure is that Emma and I are lucky to have escaped, and I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, terrified of seeing Michael's twisted face leering at me from the shadows. When we first arrived, the park seemed pretty quiet. There were a few other families scattered around, but plenty of open space and equipment for Tommy to play on. I found a bench with a good view of the playground and settled in to watch him, occasionally glancing down at my phone. After about 20 minutes, I noticed a group of 3 kids who looked to be around 10-12 years old enter the park. Something about them immediately struck me as off. They weren't with any adults, which wasn't too unusual, but they seemed to be scanning the playground intently rather than running to play. I kept a closer eye on them as they slowly made their way towards the area where Tommy was playing. At first, they just stood off to the side observing, but then they approached Tommy and started talking to him. I couldn't hear what they were saying from where I was sitting, but Tommy seemed a bit hesitant in his interactions with them. My mom instincts were starting to tingle. I got up and casually walked closer so I could overhear their conversation. As I got within earshot, I heard one of the older boys asking Tommy, "So where do you live? Do you come to this park a lot?" Another chimed in, "What's your mom's name? Is she here with you?" Alarm bells were going off in my head. Why were these kids so interested in personal details about my son? I quickened my pace to intervene, but before I could reach them, an elderly man with a small dog appeared and approached the group. "There you kids are. I've been looking all over for you," the man said in an overly cheery voice. "Who's your new little friend here?" The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This man clearly wasn't with the other kids, yet he was acting like he knew them, and now he was taking an interest in Tommy too. Something was very, very wrong here. I rushed the last few steps and inserted myself into the group. "Tommy, honey, it's time to go," I said firmly, taking his hand. The older kids and the man all took a step back, looking startled by my sudden appearance. "Oh, is this your son?" the man asked, his tone dripping with fake friendliness. "What a darling boy. We were just getting acquainted." "Yes, and we're leaving now," I replied coldly, pulling Tommy away. As we walked quickly towards the park exit, I could feel their eyes boring into my back. My heart was racing. Once we were safely in the car, I tried to calm myself down and figure out what had just happened. Had I overreacted, or had I narrowly saved my son from a potential abduction attempt? I asked Tommy what the kids and the man had been saying to him. He told me they had been asking him lots of questions: where we lived, what school he went to, if he'd like to go see some puppies. They had also been trying to convince him to leave the park with them to get ice cream. My blood ran cold. This was exactly the kind of tactic predators use to lure children. I immediately called the police to report the suspicious incident. They took my statement and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but without any concrete evidence of a crime, there wasn't much else they could do. For weeks afterwards, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't been paying attention, or if I'd arrived at the park even a few minutes later. The image of those kids and that man was seared into my brain. I kept Tommy home as much as possible for a while, too scared to take him out. When we did go out, I was hyper-vigilant, constantly scanning for threats. I had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of Tommy being snatched away while I wasn't looking. Eventually, the acute anxiety faded somewhat, but I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in public spaces with my son again. That day at the park opened my eyes to how quickly things can go wrong, how predators can appear so normal and friendly. I'm sharing this story as a warning to other parents. Please, always keep a close eye on your children. Trust your instincts if something feels off. Don't be afraid to intervene, even if you worry about seeming rude or paranoid. It's better to overreact than to ignore red flags and regret it forever. I'm so grateful that I was able to protect Tommy that day, but the experience has left deep emotional scars. The world suddenly seems like a much darker, more dangerous place. I hug my son a little tighter each night, thankful that he's safe, but always aware of how easily it could have gone another way. To this day, I still find myself scanning playgrounds and parks, looking for those kids or that man. I've never seen them again, which in some ways makes it worse. Are they still out there, looking for vulnerable children? Did they move on to another area after I foiled their plans that day? Or was it all just a misunderstanding that my panicked brain blew out of proportion? I'll never know for sure what their true intentions were. But my gut tells me we had a very close call that day. The thought of what could have happened still makes me feel sick. I've tried to find a balance between caution and letting Tommy have a normal childhood. We do still go to parks, but I'm much more selective about which ones, preferring smaller, enclosed playgrounds where I can easily see every area. I make sure to always position myself where I have a clear view of him. And I've had many conversations with him about stranger danger and what to do if anyone ever tries to get him to go somewhere. Some people, even friends and family, have told me I'm being overprotective, that I'm letting one weird incident rule our lives. But unless you've been in that situation, felt that heart-stopping fear and certainty that your child was in imminent danger, you can't understand. I'd rather be called overprotective than live with the guilt and anguish of not doing enough to keep my son safe. I still have moments where the fear and anxiety overwhelm me. Sometimes I'll be watching Tommy play and suddenly flash back to that day, imagining all the horrible what-ifs. I've started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma and learn coping strategies for the anxiety. It's a daily struggle to balance safety with allowing Tommy to grow and explore the world. I don't want him to be fearful, but I also need him to be aware and cautious. It's a heavy weight for a mother to bear. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's to always, always trust your instincts. That little voice in your head telling you something isn't right, listen to it. Act on it. Don't worry about seeming silly or paranoid. Your child's safety is worth any momentary embarrassment or inconvenience. I'm sharing this story in hopes that it might help another parent avoid a similar situation. Please, stay vigilant. Be aware of your surroundings. Know where your children are at all times. And if you ever get that gut feeling that something's wrong, don't hesitate to act. You are your child's protector. It's a huge responsibility, and sometimes a terrifying one. But staying alert and trusting your instincts can make all the difference. I'm just thankful I was able to get Tommy out of there safely that day. I shudder to think how differently things could have turned out if I hadn't been paying attention. So please, learn from my experience. Keep your kids close, stay aware, and never ignore that parental intuition. It might just save your child's life one day. It was around 11 p.m. and I was on my last delivery of the shift. The address was on some street I'd never been to before, way out on the edges of town. As I turned onto the street, I immediately got an uneasy feeling. All the houses looked dark and empty. No lights on, no cars in the driveways. It was like a ghost town. I double-checked the address and slowly rolled down the street, peering at house numbers. That's when I noticed headlights in my rear-view mirror. A black sedan had turned onto the street behind me. Didn't think much of it at first, figured it was just another car. But as I drove, I realized it was matching my exact speed and movements. My heart started racing a bit. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I found the right house number and pulled into the driveway. The black car drove slowly past, but I couldn't see inside because of the tinted windows. It gave me the creeps. I grabbed the delivery bag and walked up to the front door, glancing nervously over my shoulder. The whole street was dead silent, except for the crunching of my shoes on the frosty grass. I rang the doorbell and waited. Nothing. Rang again, still nothing. That's when I noticed the door was actually slightly ajar. A chill ran through me. Something felt very, very wrong. But I had a job to do, right? So I called out, "Hello, sandwich delivery," and pushed the door open a bit more. The house was pitch black inside. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. As the beam swept across the room, my blood ran cold. The place was completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, nothing. Just bare walls and floors. I started to back away, every instinct screaming at me to get the hell out of there. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car door shutting outside. I spun around and bolted for my car, sandwich bag forgotten on the empty floor. As I reached for my door handle, movement in the back seat caught my eye. There was someone crouched down back there, dressed all in black with a hood pulled low. I let out a strangled yell and stumbled backward. The figure started to sit up, reaching toward the door lock. In a blind panic, I sprinted down the street as fast as my legs would carry me. I could hear footsteps pounding the pavement behind me. I ran until my lungs were on fire, not daring to look back. Finally, I reached a main road with some traffic and flagged down a passing car. An older couple stopped, and I frantically explained what happened. They called the police for me and let me wait in their car until they arrived. When I told the officers my story, they exchanged a grim look. Apparently, this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. There had been a string of incidents where criminals used fake delivery addresses to lure drivers to empty houses. No one knew exactly what their endgame was. Robbery, kidnapping, who knows? But it was clear I'd had a very close call. They sent some units to check out the house, but of course there was no sign of the hooded figure or the black car by then. Just an empty house and my abandoned delivery bag. I quit my job that very night. To this day, I can't shake the fear of what might have happened if I'd been a few seconds slower getting out of there. Sometimes I still dream about those headlights following me down that dark, empty street. And I wonder, what if next time there's no escape? The whole experience left me shaken for months. I couldn't sleep properly for weeks, constantly jolting awake at every little sound. Even now, years later, I get anxious when I'm out alone at night. That feeling of being watched, of unseen danger lurking just out of sight, it never fully goes away. I've tried to piece it all together, to make sense of what happened that night. Was it just a random crime of opportunity, or was I specifically targeted somehow? The fact that they knew which car was mine, that they were able to get inside while I was at the door, it all seems so calculated. Sometimes I wonder about that hooded figure. Who were they? What did they want? The not knowing is almost worse than anything I can imagine. My mind runs wild with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I've done some research over the years, trying to find any similar cases or explanations, but there's frustratingly little information out there. It's like these incidents get swept under the rug, forgotten or ignored, which only makes me more uneasy. How many others have gone through something like this without anyone ever knowing? The police never caught the person responsible as far as I know. Sometimes I worry they're still out there, setting similar traps for other unsuspecting victims. I've thought about reaching out to other delivery drivers, warning them about what happened to me. But part of me is afraid of drawing attention to myself, of somehow putting myself back on their radar. It's hard to explain to people who haven't been through something like this. They tell me I'm being paranoid, that I need to let it go, but they don't understand. Once you've had a brush with true evil, once you've felt that primal fear of being hunted, it changes you. You realize how fragile our sense of safety really is, how quickly everything can go wrong. I still avoid driving alone at night whenever possible. I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings, always watching for cars that might be following me or people acting suspiciously. Some would call it paranoia, but to me it feels like necessary vigilance, because I know firsthand that monsters are real, and they're clever, and they're patient. In a way, the randomness of it all is the most unsettling part. I was just a normal college kid working a normal part-time job. There was nothing special about me, nothing to make me a target, which means it could have happened to anyone. It could happen to anyone, at any time. That's the thought that really keeps me up at night. I've tried therapy, meditation, all sorts of things to try to process the trauma and move on. And in many ways, I have moved on with my life. I graduated college, got a good job, started a family. But there's always a part of me that remains on high alert, waiting for those headlights to appear in my rearview mirror again. Sometimes I drive by that street, in the daytime, of course. It looks so normal, so innocuous. You'd never know by looking at it that it was the site of such a terrifying experience. I wonder about the other houses, if they're all really occupied or if some are empty, waiting to serve as stages for more sinister plans. I've considered moving away, starting fresh somewhere new where these memories don't haunt every corner. But another part of me feels like I need to stay, to keep watch in a way, as if by remaining vigilant, I can somehow prevent it from happening to someone else. There are times when I almost convince myself it was all a bad dream or an overactive imagination. But then I'll catch a glimpse of a black sedan out of the corner of my eye, or hear an unexpected sound at night, and it all comes rushing back. The fear, the adrenaline, the absolute certainty that I was moments away from a fate worse than I could imagine. I don't know if I'll ever have answers, ever understand the full truth of what happened that night. But I do know that it changed me forever. It opened my eyes to a darker side of the world, a side most people never see or choose to ignore. And while that knowledge is a burden in many ways, it's also a reminder to cherish every moment of safety and peace. Because you never know when everything might change in an instant, on a dark and lonely street in the middle of the night. First few days were completely normal. I'd pop by after work, take care of the house chores, maybe watch some TV or play video games. It was actually pretty relaxing. But then on the fourth night, things took a weird turn. I was lounging on the couch around 9 p.m. when I heard 2 sharp knocks at the front door. At first I ignored it, figuring it was probably just a neighbor or something. But then it happened again, louder this time. Feeling a bit uneasy, I went to peek through the peephole. There was a man standing there, tall, kind of scruffy looking, wearing a dark jacket. He knocked again and called out, "Hey, is Alex home?" His voice had this odd, hollow quality to it that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't answer or open the door. After a minute or two, he left. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. Probably just an old friend of Alex's who didn't know they were out of town. But I double-checked all the locks before going to bed that night. The next day passed without incident, and I started to relax again. But then around 11 p.m., as I was getting ready for bed, I heard those 2 distinctive knocks again. My heart started racing immediately. I crept to the door and looked out. It was the same guy, but this time he looked different, more disheveled, with an intense, almost manic look in his eyes. He pounded on the door and yelled, "Alex, I know you're in there. We need to talk." I was seriously freaked out at this point. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police if he didn't leave. After a few tense minutes of silence, I heard footsteps walking away. I let out a shaky breath, but I knew I wouldn't be getting much sleep that night. The next morning, I debated calling Alex and Jamie to tell them what was going on, but I didn't want to ruin their vacation over what might be nothing. Plus, a part of me was embarrassed about how scared I was, so I kept quiet and tried to go about my day normally. That evening, I made sure to lock up extra carefully before settling in to watch a movie. I must have dozed off on the couch because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to a strange sound. It took me a second to realize what it was. The front door clicking shut. My blood ran cold. I knew I had locked that door. There was no way it should be opening. I lay there frozen, straining my ears. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Someone was in the house. Panic flooded through me. I tried to grab my phone to call 911, but it wasn't on the coffee table where I'd left it. My mind was racing. How did they get in? What did they want? I needed to get out of there fast. I slowly, silently, eased myself off the couch. The footsteps were moving towards the back of the house. I crept towards the front door, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they must be able to hear it. Just as I reached for the doorknob, a floorboard creaked under my foot. The footsteps stopped. Then they started coming back towards the living room. I didn't hesitate. I yanked open the door and ran. I sprinted down the street in my socks, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached a 24-hour diner a few blocks away. Shaking and out of breath, I burst in and begged them to call the police. The next hour was a blur. Cops showed up, took my statement, then went to check out the house. I sat there sipping bad coffee, jumping at every little sound. Finally, an officer came back. "We found him," he said grimly. He was in one of the bedrooms, just sitting there in the dark. A chill ran through me. "Did he say anything? Who is he?" The cop shook his head. "That's the weird thing. He hasn't said a word since we arrested him. No ID on him either. We're taking him in for questioning." I felt sick. "What about my phone? Did you find it?" "No sign of it in the house. He must have taken it when he came in." The reality of how close I'd come to real danger started to sink in. If I hadn't woken up when I did, I didn't want to think about what might have happened. Over the next few days, more details emerged. The guy had somehow gotten a copy of the house key made. He refused to speak to the police or explain his actions. And weirdest of all, when they showed him a photo of Alex, he insisted it wasn't the right person, that the real Alex looked completely different. I ended up telling Alex and Jamie everything when they got back. They were horrified and apologetic, swearing they had no idea who the guy was or how he might have gotten a key. But I couldn't shake this nagging feeling of doubt. The whole thing was just so bizarre. It's been months now, and I still don't have any real answers. The guy eventually pled guilty to breaking and entering, but never explained his obsession with finding Alex or why he was so sure Alex lived there. Sometimes I wonder if there's more to the story that I don't know. Did Alex and Jamie have some dark secret they never told me about? Was this guy really a stranger or someone from their past? I try not to dwell on it too much, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't affect me. I'm jumpy now, always double-checking locks. I don't house-sit anymore, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear those two sharp knocks echoing in my mind, making me wonder what might have happened if I hadn't woken up in time. I kept playing, headphones on and eyes glued to the screen. But after a while, the sounds started to get more frequent and a bit louder. It was like someone was moving around, opening and closing doors. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination getting the better of me in the dark, empty house. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I paused the game and took off my headphones, straining to listen. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then I heard it clearly, slow, heavy footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors, and they seemed to be getting closer. My heart started racing. I told myself to calm down, that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the neighbor's cat that sometimes snuck in through the pet door. Or maybe the wind was making a door swing open and closed. I tried to focus back on my game, but I couldn't stop glancing nervously at the darkened hallway behind me. That's when I saw it. In the reflection on my computer screen, I caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway, a large dark shape shifting in the shadows. I froze, holding my breath. Slowly, I turned to look directly at the hall, praying I had imagined it. But there it was, a massive silhouette of a person, standing completely still, half hidden around the corner. In that moment, sheer terror gripped me. This was real. There was an intruder in my house. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront them? Try to sneak out? Call for help? I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward into the dim light cast by my computer screen. It was a man, huge and imposing, at least 6'5", and built like a linebacker. But what struck me most was his face. His eyes were wide and crazed, his mouth twisted in a disturbing grin. In each hand, he gripped a large knife, the blades glinting in the low light. That's when my survival instincts finally kicked in. In one fluid motion, I leaped up from my chair and bolted for the nearest exit, the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding after me as I ran. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grasp the door handle, but somehow I managed to yank it open and tumble outside. I sprinted across the lawn, my bare feet slipping on the dew-covered grass. I didn't dare look back, terrified of seeing that maniac right on my heels. I vaulted over the fence into my neighbor's yard, scraping my leg on the rough wood, but barely feeling it through the adrenaline. I pounded on my neighbor's door, screaming for help. Lights flicked on, and I heard voices inside, but those seconds felt like an eternity as I imagined the intruder rounding the corner at any moment. Finally, the door opened and I practically fell inside, babbling incoherently about the man in my house. My neighbor, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Peterson, managed to calm me down enough to call 911. As we waited for the police to arrive, she made me sit down and brought me a glass of water. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Every sound made me jump, convinced the intruder had followed me. When the police finally got there, they took my statement and then went to search my house. Those minutes of waiting were agonizing. I was terrified they would find nothing, that maybe I had imagined the whole thing in some kind of sleep-deprived hallucination. But then I heard shouting, followed by the crackle of a police radio calling for backup. They had found him. The intruder was still in my house, hiding in a closet. It took 3 officers to subdue him. He was that big and strong. As they led him out in handcuffs, I got my first real look at him in the light. He was older than I expected, probably in his mid-50s, with wild gray hair and a scraggly beard. His eyes were still wide and unfocused, darting around frantically. The police searched him and found 2 large hunting knives, just like I had seen. They also discovered a backpack full of duct tape, rope, and other items I don't even want to think about. It was clear he had come prepared to do something horrible. The next few hours were a blur of police interviews and crime scene investigators combing through my house. I learned that the intruder had a long history of mental illness and had recently stopped taking his medication. He had no connection to me or my family. He had simply chosen our house at random. That random nature of it all is what still haunts me the most. If I hadn't happened to see his reflection, if I had gone to bed early that night instead of staying up gaming, if I had been a little slower in running away, the outcome could have been so much worse. It's been months since that night, but I still have trouble sleeping. Every little noise in the house sets me on edge. I've started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, just in case. My parents installed a top-of-the-line security system, but it doesn't make me feel much safer. The worst part is the lingering feeling that it could happen again at any time, that there are people out there who might decide on a whim to break into your home and hurt you for no reason at all. I know how lucky I was to escape unharmed, but I can't shake the fear that my luck might run out next time. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering if there were warning signs I missed. Could I have noticed something earlier? Should I have called the police at the first strange sound? It's easy to second-guess everything in hindsight. The police told me later that the intruder had been watching our house for days, learning our routines. He knew my parents were out of town and that I would be alone. It makes my skin crawl to think of him out there, planning and waiting for the right moment to strike. I've tried talking to a therapist about it, but it's hard to explain the bone-deep fear I still feel. How do you ever feel safe again after something like that? How do you trust that the shadows in your home are just shadows and not someone waiting to hurt you? Sometimes I think about what might have happened if things had gone differently. If I hadn't seen his reflection, or if I had frozen instead of running. The police said that based on the items he brought, he likely intended to tie me up and, well, I try not to dwell on what might have come next. I know I should feel grateful that I escaped, and I am. But there's also a guilty part of me that almost wishes he had done something physical to me. At least then I would have a tangible injury to point to, something concrete to explain why I'm still so messed up over this. Instead, I'm left with invisible scars that no one else can see. The intruder is in prison now, but I know he'll be eligible for parole someday. The thought of him potentially being free again terrifies me. What if he comes back to finish what he started? The rational part of my brain knows that's unlikely, but fear isn't always rational. I've started taking self-defense classes, hoping it will help me feel more in control. But deep down, I know that no amount of training could have prepared me for that night. It all happened so fast, and the sheer terror of the moment overwhelmed everything else. Sometimes I wonder about the intruder's life story. What series of events led him to break into a stranger's home with such sinister intentions? Was he always violent, or did mental illness warp him over time? I've thought about trying to contact him in prison to ask him why he chose our house, but I'm not sure I really want to know the answer. In the end, I'm left with more questions than answers. Why me? Why that night? What if I had made different choices? The uncertainty of it all is almost worse than the actual event. At least that had a clear beginning and end. This lingering fear and doubt feels like it might never fully go away. I know I need to move on with my life. I can't let one terrible night define me forever. But it's hard to shake the feeling that everything changed that night. My sense of safety, my trust in the world, it all feels fundamentally altered. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time, I'm trying to rebuild my life and not let fear control me. But I don't think I'll ever take my safety for granted again. That night showed me how quickly everything can change, how vulnerable we all are. It's a harsh lesson, but one I'll never forget.